Tonight, before the waves remember your name, let me ask you something. If the sea itself could dream, would it dream of storms or of silence? Welcome back, or welcome for the first time, to this quiet harbour in the dark. This is a place where history breathes slowly, where ancient gods walk softly through the night, and where you are invited to drift, not toward noise or urgency, but toward rest. Wherever you are in the world right now, whether you are listening beneath city lights, beside a quiet coastline, in a countryside wrapped in wind, or under a sky heavy with stars, I'm grateful you're here. Before we begin, tell me something gentle. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Across oceans, across continents, across time zones, carried like whispers over water. And if you find peace here, if these long, slow journeys through myth and memory help you drift into sleep, consider subscribing. This channel is devoted to immersive storytelling designed for rest. Stories told in unhurried tones, drawn from the deep wells of history and legend, shaped to quiet the mind and soften the night. Tonight, we descend beneath the surface of the ancient world. We are entering the realm of Poseidon, god of the sea, earthshaker, stormbringer, a deity older than sailors' fears and as restless as the tide itself. So dim the lights. Settle into stillness. Let your breathing slow like waves folding onto shore. And together, we'll drift into the deep, before the seas bore his storms, and before sailors whispered his name into salted winds, before tridents split stone and horses thundered across plains. There was only a child fated to be devoured by his own father. Poseidon entered existence not as a ruler of oceans, but as a silent threat to a tyrant king who feared prophecy more than death. His story begins in the shadow of the Titans. The sky itself had once been a living god, Uranus, who pressed heavily upon the earth, stifling his offspring in darkness. From the anguish of the earth, goddess Gaia came rebellion. She fashioned a sickle of adamant and placed it in the hands of her son, Cronus. With a strike that separated sky from earth, Cronus castrated his father and seized dominion over the cosmos. Blood fell upon the world, and from it rose spirits of vengeance and strange beings of violence. Power had been taken through fear, and fear would now shape the reign that followed. Cronus ruled during what mortals would later call a golden age, though gold can conceal corrosion. He took his sister Rhea as queen. The world under them was fertile, abundant, untroubled by age or famine. Yet a prophecy echoed through the chambers of time. Just as Cronus had overthrown his father, so too would one of his own children overthrow him. The tyrant, who had risen through violence, became enslaved to dread. Each time Rhea bore a child, Cronus took the newborn into his hands and swallowed it whole. Thus were consumed Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and then Poseidon. There was no blood, no cry. The Titan King opened his mouth, and divine infancy vanished into living darkness. The swallowed children did not die. Gods cannot be so easily extinguished. They remain suspended within their father, imprisoned in a twilight womb of fear and digestion denied. Consider the image, a god of oceans confined within a stomach. No sky above him, no horizon, no rolling tide. Only constriction and waiting. In later hymns, he would be called earthshaker, but in his first experience of existence, he could not move the smallest stone. It is a cruel symmetry that the deity who would one day command the boundless sea began life trapped within a narrow, airless chamber. Rhea's grief deepened with each child lost. When she conceived again, despair turned to strategy. She journeyed to Gaia and sought counsel. The earth goddess, ancient and patient, understood cycles of violence better than any. A plan formed. When Rhea bore her youngest child, she wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and presented it to Cronus. The Titan swallowed it without suspicion, believing he had consumed another threat. Meanwhile, the infant Zeus was carried away to be hidden in a cave on the island of Crete. Thus began the slow undoing of tyranny. Zeus grew in secrecy, nourished by goat's milk and guarded by warriors who clashed their shields to drown out his cries. While Poseidon and his siblings remained confined within their father's body, the youngest prepared for revolt. In time, guided by Gaia's wisdom, Zeus compelled Cronus to regurgitate his swallowed children. Some myths say it was through a potion, others tell of force. However it occurred, the Titan king convulsed, and from him emerged the stone first, then the gods in reverse order of their swallowing. Poseidon came forth not as an infant, but as a fully formed deity, immortal and terrible. He had known confinement beyond mortal imagining. Emerging into light, he entered a world already trembling with imminent war. The siblings stood together, united by shared captivity and burning purpose. Against them stood Cronus and the Titans, embodiments of an older order. The conflict that followed would be known as the Titanomachy, a cataclysmic struggle lasting 10 years. Mountains shattered. The seas roared, though not yet ruled. Lightning scarred the heavens. Zeus freed the imprisoned Cyclopes and the 100-handed Hecatoncheires from Tartarus, where Cronus had cast them. In gratitude, the Cyclopes forged divine weapons. The thunderbolt for Zeus, the helm of invisibility for Hades, and for Poseidon, a trident of incomparable power. This three-pronged spear was not merely a weapon, it was an axis of authority. With it, Poseidon could shatter rock, summon springs, and churn the ocean into madness. The war's imagery is preserved in fragments: titans hurling mountains, the 100-handed giants casting boulders in relentless barrages, thunder cracking against primordial darkness. Poseidon fought beside his brothers, no longer confined, but unleashed. It is tempting to imagine that each blow he struck carried the memory of suffocation. He was no longer contained, he was expansion embodied. At last, the Olympians prevailed. The Titans were bound and cast into Tartarus, guarded by the 100-handed giants. Order shifted. A new regime rose upon the heights of Mount Olympus. Yet, victory did not mean unity without tension. Power must be distributed, and the cosmos required division. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades drew lots to determine their realms. The drawing of lots is a detail that matters, for it suggests a structured fairness among brothers rather than simple dominance. Zeus received the sky, becoming ruler of thunder and king of gods. Hades took the underworld, dominion over the dead. Poseidon drew the sea. To some, the sea might have seemed lesser than the heavens. Yet the ancient Greeks understood its vastness and terror. The Mediterranean was not a passive boundary, but a living force that determined trade, war, colonization, and survival. By lot and by temperament, Poseidon became master of the element that both connected and isolated civilizations. His domain was not merely water. The sea in Greek thought was chaos given rhythm. It was reflective, yet unfathomable, calm at dawn and annihilating by dusk. To rule it required volatility. Poseidon was not the serene blue of postcards. He was the dark green beneath a storm cloud, the undertow that drags unseen, the tremor beneath coastal stone. He established his palace beneath the waves, often described as gleaming with coral and gold, attended by sea nymphs and creatures half imagined by sailors. Yet unlike Zeus, who sat enthroned in open air, Poseidon's sovereignty was both hidden and omnipresent. Every shoreline belonged to him. Every harbour required his favour. In early hymns, he is invoked not only as god of the sea, but as earth-shaker. This aspect reaches back to older strata of belief. Earthquakes in the ancient world were sudden, violent, inexplicable. The ground itself, assumed stable, would convulse. To attribute this to Poseidon was to recognize that his power extended beneath land as well as across water. Some scholars suggest that he may once have been a chthonic or earth-centered deity before fully absorbing maritime dominion. The sea and the trembling earth share a quality of instability. Both resist human control. Poseidon's temperament reflected this duality. He could grant safe passage and abundant fish, or he could wreck fleets and swallow cities. Worship of him was practical as much as devotional. Before voyages, libations were poured. Horses were sacrificed into the surf, an offering that seems strange until one recalls that Poseidon was also associated with horses, credited in myth with their creation. The galloping of hooves and the crashing of waves share rhythm and foam. In some regions, he was worshipped inland as strongly as along coasts, especially in places prone to seismic unrest. But in this first chapter of his life, the emphasis is not yet on mortals. It is on emergence. Poseidon's identity formed through imprisonment, liberation, warfare, and allocation. He was brother to the sky and the dead, yet distinct from both. He did not seek the throne of Olympus, but neither did he submit easily to hierarchy. Later, myths would reveal tensions between him and Zeus, hints that drawing lots did not erase ambition. For now, he stands at the threshold of his reign, trident in hand, salt wind rising. The Titans lie bound, the cosmos has been partitioned. Beneath the surface of the newly ordered world, currents begin to move. One might imagine him descending for the first time into the depths that would be his kingdom. Light fractures into green shafts. Pressure builds. Strange creatures flicker at the edge of vision. There is silence, then the low thunder of distant movement. In that vast and shifting expanse, Poseidon finds something that mirrors his own history. The sea too was once confined, held apart when Uranus lay upon Gaia. The separation of sky and earth allowed oceans to breathe. Just as he had emerged from Cronus, the waters had emerged from cosmic compression. Creation in Greek myth is not clean. It is born through violence and divided through struggle. Poseidon embodies that pattern. His power is not abstract goodness. It is elemental force shaped by narrative memory. As the Olympian age begins, the sea god's story is only opening. He will contest cities, pursue loves with relentless intensity, father monsters and heroes, and unleash storms upon those who forget reverence. He will clash with Athena over Athens, with Odysseus over pride, with giants who challenge divine order. Yet all of those tales unfold from this foundation: a child swallowed by fear, a god reborn through revolt, a ruler defined by depth and upheaval. The waves that lap against ancient shores carry within them the echo of that first confinement. Perhaps that is why the sea can feel both cradle and grave. In Poseidon's origin lies the paradox of his nature. He knows what it is to be trapped, and so he resists containment. He knows what it is to be denied air, and so he commands winds to fill sails. He knows the darkness inside a tyrant, and so he does not easily forgive insult. Thus, the brother of thunder and shadow takes his place among the immortals, not above nor below, but beside. The trident gleams. The tides answer. And somewhere far beneath the surface, the memory of Cronus's swallowing lingers like a pressure that never fully dissipates. The age of Olympus has begun, and with it, the restless reign of the sea. When the lots were cast and the realms divided, the sky lifted itself higher. The underworld deepened into shadow, and the sea exhaled, as though it had been waiting for a sovereign who understood unrest. Poseidon did not ascend to a throne carved of cloud, like his brother Zeus, nor did he retreat into the solemn stillness claimed by Hades. Instead, he descended. The descent itself is rarely described in detail in surviving texts, yet it is one of the most evocative moments in his mythic life. The sea was not empty territory awaiting administration. It was ancient, inhabited, layered with presences older than the Olympian order. Before Poseidon ruled the waters, the sea already had lineage and voice. The primordial sea god Pontus had existed since the earliest stirrings of creation, born directly from Gaia without consort. From Pontus and Gaia came marine deities whose identities blurred into currents and foam. Among them was Nereus, called the Old Man of the Sea, gentle and prophetic, a figure of stability in contrast to Poseidon's volatility. Nereus fathered the Nereids, 50 sea nymphs who embodied the grace and terror of waves. There was also Tethys and Oceanus, titans whose river encircled the world in mythic geography. The sea was not a vacancy, it was a layered inheritance. Thus, when Poseidon entered his domain, he did not conquer it in the way Olympus had been seized. Rather, he asserted authority over an element that already knew power. His kingship was not creation, but consolidation. He became the central will within a vast, living system. Ancient poets describe his palace beneath the waves near Aegae, or sometimes near the island of Euboea. Though myth is fluid about divine architecture, the palace gleamed with coral columns and floors of shimmering gold, illuminated not by sunlight, but by a diffuse, shifting glow. Around him gathered sea spirits, the Nereids with stream-ana hair, hippocamps with curling tails, and equine forequarters, tritons who blew conch shells to calm or summon tides. His queen would become Amphitrite, herself a Nereid. Yet even this union reflects Poseidon's restless and forceful nature. In some versions, he pursued Amphitrite relentlessly until she fled, seeking refuge in the farthest reaches of the ocean. Only through intermediaries, often a dolphin sent to plead on his behalf, was she persuaded to return and accept marriage. The dolphin, rewarded for its service, was placed among the stars as the constellation Delphinus. The marriage of Poseidon and Amphitrite symbolizes an uneasy harmony between storm and calm. She represents the steady rhythm of tides, while he embodies the sudden upheaval that can shatter coasts. Their union produces Triton, messenger of the sea, who carries a shell horn capable of quelling or arousing waves. Through this lineage, Poseidon's authority becomes structured, almost royal in its order. Yet to understand his rule, one must consider how the Greeks experienced the sea itself. The Mediterranean was a highway and a hazard. It enabled trade between city-states and distant cultures, Egypt, Phoenicia, Anatolia, but it could destroy fleets without warning. Storms rose swiftly. Navigation depended on stars and intuition. The sea was unpredictable, but necessary. To worship Poseidon was to acknowledge dependence on forces beyond human mastery. Temples dedicated to him rose along coastlines and inland plains alike. At Cape Sunion in Attica, a temple overlooked the Aegean, its columns catching sunset light while below, waves struck rock in perpetual homage. Sacrifices were cast into surf, including horses, whose symbolism with Poseidon runs deep. In myth, he created the first horse by striking the earth with his trident. The sudden emergence of a powerful animal from solid ground mirrors the eruption of springs and earthquakes he also controlled. This association between horses and the sea is not arbitrary. The Greeks perceived visual and auditory parallels. The cresting of waves resembles flowing manes. The thunder of hooves echoes the crash of surf. In some regions, Poseidon bore the epithet Hippios, Lord of Horses. Inland communities prone to earthquakes honored him no less fervently than sailors did. Earthquakes, those terrifying ruptures of stability, were attributed to his trident striking deep foundations. When the ground trembled, it was Poseidon shifting beneath the crust. In this aspect, he is not only maritime, but tectonic, binding sea and land through instability. The Greeks lived in a seismically active region. Their theology reflects lived geography, but kingship invites rivalry. And Poseidon's reign was not without contest. One of the earliest and most symbolically charged conflicts he engaged in was his rivalry with Athena for patronage over the city that will become Athens. The contest was not merely about civic pride. It was about the orientation of Greek identity itself. According to myth, both deities offered gifts to the inhabitants of Attica. Poseidon struck the Acropolis with his trident, producing either a salt spring or, in some accounts, the first horse. Athena planted an olive tree, symbol of peace, sustenance, and long-term prosperity. The citizens judged her gift superior, choosing wisdom and agriculture over martial and maritime force. Thus, the city bore her name. This myth reflects tensions within Greek culture: sea power versus civic cultivation, volatility versus strategy. Poseidon did not accept the loss with serenity. In some versions, he flooded the plains in anger. The sea god's pride was easily wounded. His temper, like his element, could rise suddenly. Yet he did not withdraw from the affairs of mortals. He fathered numerous children across mythic landscapes. Some were monstrous, embodying the dangers of the deep. From his union with the Gorgon Medusa sprang Pegasus and Chrysaor when she was slain by Perseus. Pegasus, the winged horse, further entwines Poseidon's equine symbolism with transcendence and wild beauty. Other offspring include giants and kings, heroes and adversaries. The sea god's paternity extends across mythic genealogies, embedding him deeply in heroic cycles. He is both ancestor and antagonist, benefactor and destroyer. In Homeric epic, especially within the Odyssey, Poseidon's character sharpens into narrative focus. He becomes a divine obstacle to Odysseus' return home, enraged because the hero blinded his son, Polyphemus, a cyclops. Here Poseidon is not abstractly stormy. He is personally offended. His wrath prolongs a mortal's suffering for years. The sea becomes the medium of vengeance. Yet even this wrath reflects ancient values. Hubris against divine order demanded consequence. Odysseus' taunting of Polyphemus after escape seals his fate. Poseidon's persecution illustrates that the sea punishes arrogance. Mariners must be humble. Pride invites shipwreck. Despite tensions with Zeus at times, Poseidon remained an Olympian of immense stature. There are myths suggesting he once conspired with Hera and Athena to bind Zeus, an episode revealing that the balance of power among gods was never entirely stable. That conspiracy failed, but it shows that Poseidon's ambition did not evaporate with the drawing of lots. The sea does not forget its depth, and yet he was capable of calm. Sailors prayed for smooth passage, and often they received it. The sea at dawn, glass-like and luminous, belongs as much to Poseidon as the tempest. Greek religion did not portray gods as purely malicious or benevolent. They were forces with personalities, capable of affection, jealousy, generosity, and fury. In art, Poseidon stands tall and bearded, trident poised, muscles defined like a seasoned warrior. He is rarely depicted reclining in ease. Even in stillness there is tension in his form, as though motion waits beneath skin. He is a god, perpetually on the verge of action. As his reign matured, the Mediterranean world expanded. Colonies stretched across coasts, trade networks thickened. With each new voyage, his worship travelled. Mariners carried small icons or whispered hymns before departure. The sea was pathway and abyss, and Poseidon was invoked to mediate that paradox. Imagine ancient ships leaving harbour at dusk, oars dipping rhythmically, a libation poured into darkening water, a murmured plea, grant us fair wind, steady hull, safe return. Beneath the keel, currents moved unseen. Somewhere in the depths, the Earthshaker held his trident, not necessarily in menace, but in potential. To rule the sea is to rule uncertainty. Unlike Zeus's sky, which arcs visibly above all, or Hades' underworld, fixed in its solemn inevitability, the sea is dynamic. It reshapes shorelines, erodes certainty, conceals mysteries. Poseidon's kingship required not static governance, but perpetual responsiveness. He was not enthroned above change, he embodied it. And so, chapter 2 closes not with conquest, but with establishment. The sea has accepted its king. His palace stands beneath shifting light. Amphitrite sits beside him. Triton's horn echoes through corridors of coral, and across the ancient world, temples rise along coasts and fault lines alike. The child once swallowed now commands horizons. The god once confined now governs boundlessness. Yet in his depths, the memory of enclosure remains, perhaps fueling every surge against limitation. The tides continue their breathing, and with them, the restless sovereignty of Poseidon endures. Even after the sea had accepted its king, the earth itself did not rest easily beneath him. Poseidon was not a god content with boundaries. Though the drawing of lots had assigned him dominion over the waters, the ancient world did not divide itself neatly into sky, sea, and underworld. Coastlines blurred categories, islands rose from ocean beds, springs burst from dry rock, earthquakes split plains and reshaped harbours. Where land met water, so too did the authority of gods overlap. It is within these margins that Poseidon's rivalry with other Olympians became most pronounced. The most famous of these contests, preserved in multiple sources and local traditions, was his struggle with Athena for the patronage of the city that would bear her name. Yet to see this merely as a quarrel over a single city is to misunderstand its symbolic depth. This was a contest between temperaments, between two visions of civilization. The land of Attica was rugged and dry, edged by a glittering coastline that opened onto the Aegean. Its people relied upon both agriculture and maritime trade. When the gods sought to claim the loyalty of this emerging polis, they did so through gifts. Poseidon, embodying force and immediacy, struck the Acropolis with his trident. In some tellings, a salt spring burst forth, its waters undrinkable but powerful in spectacle. In others, a horse sprang from the rock, magnificent, strong, suited for war and speed. Athena's gift was quieter. She planted an olive tree, offering fruit, oil, wood, and a symbol of sustained prosperity. Where Poseidon's gift dazzled and intimidated, hers promised continuity. The citizens chose Athena. In this choice, myth encodes a cultural truth. Athens would become renowned not for naval terror alone, but for philosophy, governance, and art. Yet Poseidon's connection to the city did not vanish. A sacred saltwater well on the Acropolis was said to be the mark of his trident, and during storms, its waters could still be heard echoing as though stirred by distant waves. Even in defeat, he left a presence. But Athens was not his only contention. Across the Greek world, local traditions recorded disputes between Poseidon and other deities for control of territories. In Corinth, he contended with Helios. In Argolis, with Hera. Often these disputes were settled by arbitration from river gods or other divine judges, reflecting perhaps political realities among city-states that trace their patronage to different Olympians. Myth mirrored diplomacy. These rivalries reveal something essential about Poseidon's character. He was assertive, proud, and unwilling to be peripheral. Though Zeus ruled the heavens as king of gods, Poseidon's power was not subordinate in magnitude, only in scope. The sea encircled Greece. It was trade route, defense line, and source of sustenance. To control the sea was to influence destiny. Yet even within Olympus, tensions simmered. There exists a myth, recounted in later sources, that Poseidon once joined Hera and Athena in a conspiracy against Zeus. They sought to bind him, perhaps resentful of his autocratic tendencies. The plan was nearly successful. Zeus was restrained, and for a moment, the hierarchy of Olympus trembled. But the 100-handed giant Briareus intervened, freeing Zeus and restoring order. The conspirators were punished. Poseidon, in some accounts, was temporarily stripped of privilege. Whether this myth reflects genuine theological tension or later narrative embellishment, it underscores that Poseidon was not docile. He was brother to Zeus, not servant. The sea does not bow easily to the sky. This defiant streak manifests powerfully in the myths surrounding Troy. Before the events immortalized in epic, Poseidon and Apollo once served the Trojan king Laomedon. The reason varies by source. Sometimes punishment from Zeus, sometimes voluntary service. But the task was monumental: to build the great walls of Troy. Together, they constructed fortifications so formidable that they would later withstand Greek assault for years. When the work were complete, Laomedon refused to pay them the promised reward. To cheat a god is to misunderstand the structure of reality. In vengeance, Poseidon sent a sea monster to ravage the Trojan coast. The creature devoured and destroyed until appeased by sacrifice. Only through the intervention of Heracles was the monster slain, though Laomedon's treachery would echo into the generation that fought the Trojan War. This episode reveals another facet of Poseidon's domain. He commands creatures of the deep. Sea monsters in Greek myth are not mere beasts. They are extensions of divine wrath. They emerge when oaths are broken, when arrogance prevails. By the time of the Trojan War itself, Poseidon's loyalties are complex. In Homer's Iliad, he supports the Greeks, partly due to lingering resentment against Troy's royal house. He strides across the battlefield in disguise, rallying Achaean forces, shaking earth with his tread. When Zeus temporarily forbids divine interference, Poseidon initially complies, but eventually defies the command, unable to tolerate Trojan ascendancy. In one vivid passage, he moves across the sea in a chariot drawn by golden-maned horses, the waves parting before him. The image fuses his equine symbolism with maritime majesty. Foam gathers beneath hooves that do not sink. The sea becomes road. And yet, despite his power, Poseidon cannot simply override fate. Even gods in Greek myth operate within constraints. Troy's fall is destined, but the path to that fall requires mortal agency and divine negotiation. Poseidon influences, agitates, empowers, but does not unilaterally decide. This limitation is crucial. Greek religion did not conceive of gods as omnipotent in the later monotheistic sense. They were immensely powerful, yet enmeshed within a cosmos governed by Moira, fate. Poseidon could shatter cliffs, but he could not erase destiny. His temperament in these epics is volatile, but not irrational. He rewards respect and punishes hubris. He aids heroes when it suits divine balance and obstructs them when pride intrudes. Consider again the story of Odysseus, preserved in the Odyssey. When the hero blinds Polyphemus, he initially escapes unnoticed, but pride compels him to reveal his name, taunting the Cyclops. Polyphemus calls upon his father Poseidon for vengeance. The sea god answers, not immediately with annihilation, but with prolonged wandering. Storms scatter Odysseus' fleet. Winds drive him from harbour to harbour. Companions perish. Home recedes into memory. Poseidon's wrath is not a single wave, but a sustained current of misfortune. What is striking is that when Odysseus finally returns to Ithaca, it is not through defeating Poseidon in combat, but through endurance and humility. He learns restraint. The sea's lesson is patience. Beyond epic, Poseidon's mythic presence seeps into countless regional traditions. In Arcadia, far from the coast, he was worshipped as a horse god associated with springs and earthquakes. There, he pursued the goddess Demeter when she took the form of a mare to escape him. In response, he transformed into a stallion. From their union came the divine horse Arion. This myth, unsettling to modern sensibilities, reflects archaic layers of belief in which divine unions are expressions of elemental forces rather than moral narratives. Poseidon's relationships often carry this intensity. He is not a gentle suitor. Like the sea, he advances relentlessly. Yet, from these unions emerge heroes and wonders that shape mythic history. He fathers Theseus in some traditions, linking him indirectly to Athenian identity despite losing the patronage contest. Theseus, slayer of the Minotaur and unifier of Attica, embodies both maritime adventure and civic formation. Through him, Poseidon's influence intertwines with the very city that chose Athena. Thus, rivalry does not erase connection. In Greek myth, conflict generates interdependence. As Greek colonization expanded from the 8th century BCE onward, Poseidon's worship traveled. Seafaring communities in Magna Graecia and along the Black Sea invoked him before founding settlements. The sea was both barrier and bridge. To cross it was to trust the god whose moods determine survival. Temples dedicated to him often occupied dramatic coastal promontories. Their placement was not arbitrary. They stood as markers of reverence and as visual reminders to sailors approaching land that the boundary between mortal and divine was thin at the water's edge. And always, beneath narrative variations, the same core truth persists. Poseidon represents instability harnessed, but never fully subdued. He is civilization's uneasy ally. Cities flourish through maritime trade, yet storms can undo prosperity overnight. In this chapter of his mythic life, we see not only a ruler of waves, but a participant in the shaping of human identity. Through rivalry with Athena, he defines what a city values. Through alliance and conflict at Troy, he shapes epic memory. Through vengeance against Odysseus, he instructs generations about humility before nature. The Sea King is not isolated in coral halls. He is present wherever ambition meets uncertainty. And so the waters continue to surge against stone. The trident remains poised. Rivalries fade into legend, yet their echoes persist in the rhythms of tide and tectonic shift. Poseidon's story moves outward now, into love and loss, into monsters born of foam and fury, into deeper storms that will test both gods and mortals. The sea has claimed its king. The mortal world, however, is still learning what that claim truly means. If the sea had only storms, it would be simple to fear. If it had only calm, it would be simple to love. But the sea holds both in the same body, and so too does Poseidon. His story cannot be told through dominion and rivalry alone. It must also pass through longing, pursuit, transformation, and birth. For from his unions came creatures of terror and beauty alike, and through them, the ancient imagination sought to understand the generative violence of nature itself. Among his most consequential encounters was that with Medusa. Before she was a gorgon with serpents for hair, Medusa, in some traditions, was a maiden of striking beauty. The later Roman poet Ovid tells that Poseidon lay with her in a temple of Athena, an act that provoked the goddess's fury. Athena transformed Medusa into a monster whose gaze turned mortals to stone. Earlier Greek sources are less explicit about violation and punishment, but the association between Poseidon and Medusa remains consistent. When Perseus beheaded Medusa, two beings sprang from her severed neck: Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a warrior figure. That Pegasus emerged from this violent death is deeply symbolic. The horse, already tied to Poseidon through his creation of the first steed, now appears winged, transcendent, born from blood and sea lineage. In some accounts, Pegasus later struck Mount Helicon with his hoof, creating the Hippocrene spring sacred to the Muses. Thus, from a union marked by divine tension arises inspiration itself. Poseidon's paternity extends across mythic geography. With Amphitrite, he fathered Triton, who became a herald of the sea. Depicted as half man, half fish, bearing a conch-shell trumpet, Triton's blasts could calm waves or summon them into frenzy. In art and literature, Triton is sometimes singular, sometimes multiplied into a race of Tritons, who accompany Poseidon's chariot. They represent the articulate voice of the ocean, the sound that carries across water before a storm. Yet not all offspring of Poseidon were harmonious extensions of his realm. Many embodied its dangers. The Cyclops Polyphemus, encountered in the Odyssey, was his son by the sea nymph, Thoosa. Polyphemus is pastoral in his isolation, tending sheep in a cave, yet monstrous in appetite and cruelty. When Odysseus blinds him, Poseidon's rage is paternal as much as divine. Through Polyphemus, we glimpse a version of Poseidon's lineage that is raw, unrefined, strength without civilization. Another child, the giant Antaeus, born of Poseidon and Gaia, derived strength from contact with the earth. He challenged travelers to wrestling matches and killed them. Only when Heracles lifted him off the ground was he defeated. Again, Poseidon's offspring are tied to elemental force. In this case, the earth itself. The sea god's reach extends beneath land through seismic power. His children often mirror that connection. Perhaps most emblematic of the sea's terror is the creature known as the Cretan bull in some traditions, or the bull sent against Minos. When King Minos of Crete prayed to Poseidon for a sign to legitimize his rule, the god sent a magnificent white bull from the sea, with the expectation that it would be sacrificed in gratitude. Minos, captivated by its beauty, substituted another animal. Divine favor cannot be manipulated without consequence. Poseidon caused the bull to become wild and destructive. In some accounts, he also inspired Minos' wife Persephone with unnatural desire for the bull, leading to the birth of the Minotaur. Through these stories, a pattern emerges. Poseidon responds sharply to broken promises. The sea may grant abundance, but betrayal invites chaos. The Minotaur, confined within the labyrinth, is indirectly a product of the sea god's offended honor. Later, Theseus, sometimes said to be Poseidon's own son, will slay the Minotaur, untangling a curse that began with a failure of sacrifice. The irony is striking. Poseidon's lineage both creates and resolves catastrophe. He fathers monsters and heroes who confront them. His generative force is not morally aligned. It is dynamic, producing life in unpredictable forms. Among his more enigmatic children are the Aloidae, twin giants Otus and Ephialtes, who attempted to storm Olympus by piling mountains upon one another. Their audacity reflects inherited boldness. They sought to challenge the divine order itself. Though ultimately slain, their rebellion echoes the earlier Titanomachy. Through them, Poseidon's bloodline brushes against cosmic upheaval once more. Yet not all his unions end in monstrosity or violence. Some reflect local cult traditions in which Poseidon merges with regional deities. In Arcadia, he was worshipped alongside Demeter in a sanctuary where both held chthonic aspects. There, myths describe Demeter taking the form of a mare to escape his pursuit. Poseidon transformed into a stallion and united with her, resulting in the birth of the horse Arion and a daughter sometimes called Despoina, whose name was kept secret in cult practice. Such myths may preserve archaic rituals related to fertility and seasonal cycles. To modern ears, they may seem troubling, but within their ancient context, they express the raw, untamed intersection of natural forces. Poseidon does not symbolize romantic love. That domain belongs more to Aphrodite. Instead, he embodies desire as momentum, the unstoppable surge that reshapes coastlines. Even his courtship of Amphitrite reflects this pattern. When she fled his advances, it was not gentleness that won her, but persistence mediated by a dolphin. The dolphin's elevation to the stars suggests that reconciliation and mediation are possible within Poseidon's realm. But they require intercession. The sea itself is fertile beyond measure. Countless species emerge from its depths. Ancient Greeks, observing this abundance, projected similar fecundity onto its god. His progeny populate islands and mainland alike, binding genealogies to maritime identity. One must also consider Poseidon's symbolic association with springs. By striking the earth, he could cause fresh water to burst forth. This ability blurs boundaries between salt and sweet, between sea and river. In mythic logic, underground water connects oceans to inland sources. Thus, Poseidon's power extends invisibly beneath the soil. He is invoked not only by sailors, but by those who depend on wells. In some traditions, he was even called the tamer of horses, and invoked in equestrian games. At the Isthmian Games, held near Corinth in his honor, athletic competitions paralleled the more famous Olympic Games dedicated to Zeus. These festivals reinforced his stature within the pantheon. Athletes competed not only for glory, but in reverence to the god whose trident could fracture the stadium ground itself. The emotional texture of Poseidon's myths oscillates between awe and fear. He is rarely portrayed as introspective. Unlike Apollo, who embodies measured clarity, or Athena, who strategizes with foresight, Poseidon reacts. His responses are immediate, tidal. Yet within that immediacy lies consistency. He defends honor, punishes deceit, rewards devotion. In literature and art, his beard streams like sea foam, his gaze distant as horizon. He stands at the edge of stability. Behind him, waves rise. Before him, mortals kneel or flee. As we move through these stories, we begin to understand that Poseidon's narrative function is to externalize forces that ancient peoples experience daily. Storm surges, shipwrecks, earthquakes, the unpredictable fertility of livestock. All could be framed as manifestations of his will. To tell stories of his lovers and offspring was to map the contours of risk and reward in a precarious world. Yet amid monsters and vengeance, there remains a strange beauty. Pegasus ascending skyward from blood, Triton's horn echoing across dawn-lit waters, a dolphin guiding a reluctant bride back to coral halls. Even the sea monster sent against Troy is later slain by a hero whose fame endures. Creation and destruction are interwoven in Poseidon's wake. The chapter closes with an image. Beneath a moonlit surface, currents intertwine. In a palace of shifting light, Amphitrite sits beside her storm-bearing lord. Around them move beings born of longing and fury. Some will terrorize mortals, some will inspire them. All carry within their forms the pulse of the sea. Poseidon remains what he has always been, not merely ruler of water, but but embodiment of the generative, destabilizing force that shapes both coastlines and stories. And the tide continues outward, toward new conflicts and deeper reckonings yet to unfold. There are angers that flare and vanish like sparks in dry grass, and there are angers that move like weather systems, vast, patient, and impossible to outrun. The wrath of Poseidon belonged to the second kind. When offended, he did not merely strike once. He altered conditions. He shifted currents. He rearranged the very pathways by which mortals travelled home. No story reveals this more fully than his long persecution of Odysseus in the Odyssey. The insult itself was at first glance simple. Odysseus and his men, blown off course after the fall of Troy, came upon the island of the Cyclopes. There they encountered Polyphemus, son of Poseidon, a being immense in strength, solitary in habit, and unbound by the customs of hospitality that structured Greek moral life. The Cyclops trapped the men in his cave and devoured several of them raw. Faced with annihilation, Odysseus devised a plan. He offered wine, sharpened a stake, and when the giant slept, drove the burning wood into his single eye. It was an act of survival, but survival was not enough for Odysseus. As he sailed away, secure in escape, he could not resist revealing his name. He called back across the surf, declaring himself Odysseus of Ithaca, conqueror of Troy. In doing so, he transformed anonymous cunning into personal triumph. Polyphemus, blinded and bleeding, lifted his hands to the sky and prayed to his father. He asked that Odysseus never return home, or if he must return, that it be late, alone, and in sorrow. The sea heard. Poseidon was not present on the island at that moment. In Homer's telling, he was away among the Ethiopians, receiving sacrifice at the far edges of the world. But distance does not limit divine perception. When he learned what had been done to his son, the offense crystallized into sustained retribution. It is essential to understand that Poseidon's response was not merely paternal outrage. It was also a defense of order. The Cyclopes, though monstrous to Greek sensibilities, were part of the divine family. To maim one was to disrupt hierarchy. Yet Odysseus's greater error lay in hubris, in announcing himself, in demanding recognition for violence. The sea god's punishment would teach a lesson about humility, written in wind and wave. From that moment forward, the Mediterranean became a labyrinth. Storms rose without warning. Winds shifted direction in the night. Land appeared, then vanished behind squalls. Odysseus and his crew drifted from island to island, encountering the lotus eaters, Circe, the sirens, Scylla, and Charybdis. While not every peril was directly sent by Poseidon, the overarching condition of displacement was his design. He did not need to hurl thunderbolts like Zeus. He needed only to disturb the sea. In one of the epic's most vivid passages, Odysseus builds a raft after years of captivity with Calypso. At last, he sets sail, hopeful. But Poseidon sees him from afar and gathers storm clouds. He shatters the raft with waves like mountains. The hero clings to wreckage, battered for days, nearly drowned. Only through divine assistance from the sea goddess Ino and the river god of Scheria does he survive. Notice the subtlety. Poseidon does not simply kill Odysseus. He prolongs struggle. The punishment matches the crime. Pride answered with endurance. Odysseus, famed for clever speech, is reduced to silence against roaring surf. And yet, even within wrath, there are boundaries. Fate, Moira, governs the ultimate return. Odysseus is destined to reach Ithaca. Poseidon cannot undo that decree. What he can do is delay, complicate, and inflict loss. By the time Odysseus arrives home, he has lost every companion. His fleet is gone. His glory has thinned into exhaustion. The sea, God's vengeance, is transformative rather than terminal. This pattern recurs elsewhere. When mortals violate sacred expectation, Poseidon answers with environmental upheaval. Consider the tale of King Minos and the Cretan bull once more. The refusal to sacrifice the white bull was not a trivial oversight. It was a breach of reciprocity between mortal and divine. In response, Poseidon did not strike Minos directly. He turned the bull wild, destabilizing Crete's landscape, and, through Persephone's unnatural desire, set in motion the birth of the Minotaur. The consequences ripple outward. Theseus must journey to Crete. The labyrinth is built. Youths are sacrificed annually. One broken promise reshapes generations. This is how the sea operates. A single tremor, deep below, can generate waves that reach distant shores. Poseidon's anger also manifests geographically. Earthquakes, sudden ruptures of stability, were attributed to his trident striking bedrock. In a region as seismically active as Greece, such explanations were not poetic exaggerations, but theological necessity. When the ground split and temples fell, communities interpreted the disaster as divine displeasure or warning. He was called Enosigaios, Earthshaker. Unlike storms, which move across the visible sky, earthquakes erupt from below. They're reminders that solidity is illusion. In this, Poseidon's power extends beyond water. He governs instability wherever it resides. The same force that churns seas unsettles foundations. And yet, Greek religion did not reduce him to perpetual fury. Sailors invoked him for calm passage as fervently as they feared his storms. The same god who wrecked Odysseus's raft could smooth waters for merchant vessels carrying grain and olive oil. His worship involved appeasement, but also gratitude. At the Isthmus of Corinth, the Isthmian Games honored him with athletic contests. Competitors raced horses and chariots, echoing his equine associations. Victors crowned with pine wreaths celebrated not destruction, but excellence under his patronage. Even wrathful gods could be patrons of skill and discipline. The emotional complexity of Poseidon lies in this duality. He is not chaos incarnate, he is structured volatility. His reactions follow patterns rooted in honor, reciprocity, and cosmic balance. When respected, he sustains. When slighted, he destabilizes. In the broader context of Greek myth, his wrath serves narrative function. It propels journeys, tests heroes, and exposes flaws. Without Poseidon's opposition, the Odyssey would lack its central tension. Odysseus's identity is forged not merely through cleverness, but through survival against elemental force. One might imagine Poseidon observing from beneath the waves as ships traverse his domain. He does not always intervene. Many voyages pass uneventfully. But when arrogance surfaces, when captains boast that they need no divine favor, the sea remembers. Even cities were not immune. Coastal settlements vulnerable to tidal surge or seismic shift recognize their dependence. Offerings cast into harbors were not superstition alone. They were acknowledgements of vulnerability. As centuries passed and Greek culture evolved, philosophical interpretations of the gods grew more abstract. Yet Poseidon remained tied to tangible experience. Every fisherman who felt the deck lurch beneath his feet understood the immediacy of the sea's will. In art, sculptors captured him poised with trident raised, muscles taut, beard flowing. There is always motion implied. He is rarely depicted seated in contemplative stillness. He stands at the threshold of action. And still, beneath the anger, there remains memory. Recall that Poseidon himself began existence imprisoned within Cronus. Confinement marked his origin. Perhaps this early experience shapes his intolerance for insult. To be diminished, ignored, or deceived is to risk a return to powerlessness. His wrath asserts presence, but even gods evolve within narrative time. By the end of the Odyssey, Odysseus' reconciliation with Poseidon is implied through ritual. The prophet Tiresias instructs the hero to journey inland, carrying an oar until he meets people who mistake it for a winnowing fan, a sign that they do not know the sea. There, he must plant the oar and sacrifice to Poseidon, appeasing the god far from salt water. This image is extraordinary. The sea's influence reaches so far that even inland communities must acknowledge it. Odysseus' final act of piety restores equilibrium. Wrath subsides not through defeat, but through recognition. Thus, Chapter 5 closes with a wide horizon. Ships move cautiously across the wine-dark sea. Beneath them, currents shift according to moods older than memory. Poseidon's anger has reshaped heroes and humbled kings, yet it has also preserved cosmic balance. The sea does not hate, it responds. And somewhere beyond sight, the Earthshaker rests his trident against coral stone, knowing that calm and storm alike remain within his grasp. There are places where land seems to hesitate before surrendering itself to water. Cliffs lean outward, wind gathers force, the horizon stretches without interruption. It was upon such thresholds that the ancient Greeks most often raised sanctuaries to Poseidon. Not in the quiet center of cities alone, but at their margins, where certainty ended and risk began. To understand Poseidon fully, one must leave epic poetry for a moment and stand among stone columns facing the sea. At Cape Sunion in Attica, high above the Aegean, the temple of Poseidon rises against sky and surf. Sailors rounding the cape in antiquity would see its white marble long before they reach safe harbour. It was a signal and a plea at once. The promontory itself drops sharply into the water. Waves batter its base relentlessly. The choice of site is not ornamental. It declares that this god belongs where elements collide. Further west, at the Isthmus of Corinth, another major sanctuary honoured him. The Isthmus was a narrow strip of land connecting mainland Greece to the Peloponnese, a place of passage. Ships were sometimes dragged across it to avoid the long and dangerous voyage around southern capes. Here, Poseidon was worshipped not only as sea lord, but as protector of transit and transformation. The Isthmian Games, held in his honour, drew athletes and spectators from across the Greek world, reinforcing a shared identity shaped by maritime culture. In these spaces, sacrifice was central. Bulls, rams, and horses were offered. The symbolism of the horse deserves pause. Poseidon's connection to horses is ancient, perhaps predating his full assimilation as sea god. In Linear B tablets from Mycenaean Greece, his name appears as Poseidao or Poseidawone, suggesting that he may originally have been a major deity of the Mycenaean pantheon. possibly even more prominent than Zeus in certain regions. Some scholars propose that Poseidon began as an earth or underworld deity associated with earthquakes and horses before absorbing maritime attributes as Greek culture expanded seaward. This layered identity explains why inland communities worshipped him fervently. In Arcadia, far from the coast, he was venerated as Poseidon Hippios, Lord of Horses. There, springs and seismic tremors reinforced his presence. When an earthquake struck, it was not seen as random geological motion. It was the god shifting beneath the crust. The term earthshaker was not metaphor, but explanation. Imagine the lived experience, a quiet afternoon disrupted by trembling ground. Walls crack, dust fills the air, livestock panic. Without modern seismology, the only framework available was divine agency. Poseidon's trident had struck. Perhaps a vow had been neglected. Perhaps ritual required renewal. Thus, religion was not abstract theology. It was response to environment. Even sailors far from home carried portable devotion. Small figurines, carved images, or whispered hymns accompanied voyages. Before departure, libations of wine might be poured into the harbour. Before storms, prayers rose above the wind. Gratitude followed safe return. Yet worship was not purely transactional. Festivals fostered community. At the Isthmian Games, competitors raced chariots, an echo of the god's mythic chariot drawn by golden-maned horses that skimmed across waves. Victors gained prestige not only for themselves, but for their city-states. Through shared reverence, disparate poleis acknowledged common dependence on the sea. The sea connected Greece. It also exposed it. Trade routes brought wealth, but also invasion. Naval power became decisive in conflicts such as the Persian Wars centuries later. Though those historical events fall beyond the mythic age, the cultural reverence for Poseidon shaped attitudes toward maritime strength. Athens' later naval empire, built upon triremes slicing through Aegean waters, carried implicit acknowledgement of the god whose domain they traversed. Artistic representations evolved with time. In archaic sculpture, Poseidon appears rigid and frontal, trident poised. By the classical period, statues capture dynamic motion. Muscles twisting, beard flowing, gaze fixed on distant threat. The famous bronze statue, often identified as either Zeus or Poseidon from Cape Artemision, embodies this energy. If it is indeed Poseidon, he stands moments before hurling his trident, body coiled with restrained force. The ambiguity of identity itself reflects overlapping iconography among gods of power. Literary hymns to Poseidon emphasize both reverence and caution. In the Homeric hymn dedicated to him, he is praised as tamer of horses and savior of ships. The dual epithets reveal expectation. He can guide safely or unleash ruin. Beyond mainland Greece, colonies established along the coasts of southern Italy, Sicily, and the Black Sea carried his worship outward. In Paestum, originally called Poseidonia, grand temples rose in his name. Even as local traditions blended with Greek practice, the sea god remained central to identity in settlements dependent on maritime trade. Yet, with the rise of philosophical thought in the classical period, interpretations of the gods began to shift. Thinkers like Xenophanes critiqued anthropomorphic depictions, arguing that gods in human form reflected human imagination. Later philosophers, such as Plato and Aristotle, approached natural phenomena with increasing rational inquiry. Earthquakes and storms gradually acquired proto-scientific explanations. Still, myth endured. Even as intellectual elites debated cosmology, fishermen and farmers continued to pour offerings. Religion and philosophy coexisted rather than replaced one another. Poseidon's presence persisted in ritual long after mythic narratives crystallized. One must also consider the Roman adaptation of the Greek pantheon. When Rome encountered Greek culture, it identified Poseidon with Neptune. Though Roman religion had its own maritime traditions, Neptune absorbed much of Poseidon's mythology. The sea god's influence thus extended beyond Greek shores into a broader Mediterranean world. Yet in Rome, Neptune's character softened slightly, reflecting Roman sensibilities and political structure. While storms remained part of his identity, the intense narrative focus on personal vengeance seen in Homer was less emphasized. This adaptation illustrates how deities evolve across cultures, shaped by local needs. Returning to Greece, imagine twilight at Cape Sonion. The sun sinks into the Aegean. Columns glow amber, then fade into silhouette. Wind hums through fluted stone. Below, waves strike rock in steady rhythm. In such a place, myth feels tangible. One understands why ancient worshippers sensed presence. Poseidon's temples were not hidden in forests or valleys. They faced openness. They invited contemplation of distance. They reminded observers that beyond visible shore lay uncertainty, and that uncertainty had a name. The sea's edge is liminal space. It is where merchants depart and soldiers embark. It is where loved ones watch sails disappear. It is where wreckage washes ashore. To build sanctuaries, there was to acknowledge vulnerability. Yet vulnerability is not solely fear. It is also possibility. Without the sea, Greece would have remained isolated valleys divided by mountains. With it, ideas travelled. Alphabet, art, trade goods, stories, all moved along maritime routes. Poseidon's domain was conduit as well as threat. Thus, his worship carried gratitude alongside apprehension. As centuries turned and Christianity spread through the Mediterranean, pagan temples fell into disuse. Columns crumbled, ritual fires went cold, but the sea did not change. Storms continued. Earth tremors persisted. Mariners still prayed, though to different names. Poseidon receded from active worship into literature and art. He became figure of epic, subject of Renaissance painting, symbol of untamed force. Yet, even in metaphor, his essence endured. To call the sea restless or angry echoes ancient theology. In studying his cult and sanctuaries, we see that Poseidon was not peripheral among Olympians. He was foundational to how Greeks understood their geography and economy. His myths dramatize personal conflict. His temples anchor communal identity. And so, as this chapter draws to a close, the image remains. Stone columns at the brink of blue expanse, wind carrying salt, waves repeating ancient rhythms, older than Olympus itself. Somewhere in that sound, in the crash and withdrawal, in the steady breathing of tide, lingers the memory of a god who was once swallowed, who rose in war, who claimed the sea not as ornament, but as essence. The temples may erode, the names may shift, but the edge of the world remains, and with it, the enduring shadow of the Earthshaker. Long before marble temples faced the Aegean, before epic poets shaped his temper into verse, before even the Olympian order rose from the wreckage of the Titans, there was a deeper current moving beneath the name of Poseidon. To follow his story fully, we must drift backward. Beyond Homer, beyond Hesiod, beyond the classical imagination, into the dim strata of Bronze Age memory. In the Mycenaean world, centuries before the traditional date of the Trojan War, scribes pressed symbols into clay tablets using linear B script. Among records of grain, livestock, and offerings appears a name that scholars recognize as an early form of Poseidon, Poseidao, or Poseidawone. Strikingly, this name appears with frequency that suggests prominence, perhaps even supremacy. This challenges the later image of Zeus as unquestioned king. In some Mycenaean centers, Poseidon may have been the chief deity. The tablets associate him with offerings substantial enough to indicate major cult importance. In certain cases, he is linked with titles that imply dominion extending beyond the sea. Why would a sea god hold such stature in an era when Mycenaean palatial centers were inland fortresses like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos? The answer may lie not in water alone, but in earth. The Mycenaean world was deeply familiar with seismic activity. The Aegean region sits upon tectonic boundaries. Earthquakes shaped landscapes and toppled structures. Some archaeologists even theorize that seismic destruction contributed to the collapse of Mycenaean palace civilization around the 12th century BCE. If Poseidon's earliest aspect was that of Earthshaker rather than purely Sea Lord, his prominence becomes clearer. A deity who controlled the trembling ground would command reverence in fortified cities built of stone. Later Greek tradition preserved this chthonic dimension. Epithets such as enosigaios emphasize the shaking of land. His trident does not merely stir waves, it strikes bedrock. Springs burst from earth at his touch. In mythic geography, underground waters connect rivers and seas, forming a hidden network beneath the surface. Poseidon's reach extends invisibly below soil. Some scholars propose that the name Poseidon itself may derive from elements meaning husband of the earth or lord of the earth, though etymology remains debated. If so, his original identity may have intertwined with agricultural fertility as much as maritime force. Over time, as Greek society shifted toward increased seafaring and colonization, the maritime aspect of his character likely expanded. The sea became central to trade and warfare. The god adapted accordingly, absorbing and reflecting cultural evolution. This fluidity is characteristic of ancient religion. Deities were not static constructs, but living symbols shaped by geography and need. As communities migrated, intermarried, and exchanged stories, gods merged and transformed. Poseidon's connection to horses may also originate in this archaic layer. Horses were prestigious animals in the Bronze Age, symbols of status and power. Chariot warfare dominated elite combat. A god associated with horses would command martial respect. The image of Poseidon driving a chariot across waves may represent a synthesis. The noble horse of aristocratic warfare fused with the expanding maritime horizon of later Greece. In Arcadia, one of the most conservative regions in preserving ancient cult practices, Poseidon retained strong earth and horse associations. There he was worshipped alongside Demeter in forms that suggest fertility rites older than Olympian myth. The sanctuary at Lycosura honored Despoina, daughter of Demeter and Poseidon, whose true name was known only to initiates. This secrecy hints at mystery traditions predating classical storytelling. Such cults remind us that myth, as preserved in literature, is only one layer of religious experience. Beneath polished epics lay rituals, seasonal ceremonies, and localized beliefs rarely recorded in full. Even the famous contest with Athena for Athens may encode older tensions between competing cults. Perhaps rival priesthoods or regional traditions once vied for prominence, later reframed as divine rivalry. The salt spring on the Acropolis and the sacred olive tree stand as mythologized symbols of historical negotiation. In considering Poseidon's deep past, one must also acknowledge the wider Mediterranean context. The sea connected Greece to older civilizations: Minoan Crete, Anatolia, the Levant, Egypt. Maritime deities existed in many of these cultures. Exchange of mythic motifs was inevitable. The Minoans, whose civilization flourished on Crete before Mycenaean dominance, were profoundly maritime. Their art features dolphins, octopuses, and marine life with striking vibrancy. While direct lines of religious continuity are difficult to prove, it is plausible that elements of Minoan sea worship flowed into later Greek conceptions of Poseidon. When the Mycenaeans absorbed Crete, they likely inherited aspects of its religious framework. Thus, Poseidon's later status as sea king may reflect synthesis rather than origin. The collapse of the Bronze Age palaces around 1200 BCE ushered in centuries of relative obscurity, often called the Greek Dark Ages. Written records vanished. Oral tradition carried memory forward. When literacy returned in the 8th century BCE, poets like Homer and Hesiod shaped inherited fragments into coherent pantheons. By then, Poseidon had assumed his familiar Olympian position, brother of Zeus and Hades, ruler of the sea. Yet echoes of his older stature persisted in his temperament. He is not deferential to Zeus, he challenges him. He does not remain confined to one domain. He shakes earth and sires kings. Understanding this layered evolution deepens appreciation for his complexity. He is not merely a character in stories, but a convergence point for centuries of environmental experience and cultural exchange. Imagine the earliest worshippers standing not before marble columns, but before simple altars of stone. Perhaps they had felt the ground convulse beneath their feet. Perhaps they had seen tidal surges swallow farmland. Without scientific frameworks, they articulated awe and fear through divine personality. The god who shakes and floods became a narrative anchor. By naming him, they rendered chaos relational. One can plead with a god. One cannot plead with tectonic plates. As Greek society stabilized and city-states formed, myth provided continuity. Poseidon's story bridged eras. He belonged to the Mycenaean palaces, to archaic colonists, to classical philosophers, to Hellenistic poets. Even in decline of pagan worship under Roman and later Christian dominance, his image endured in art and metaphor. Renaissance painters revived him, trident raised amid swirling sea foam. Sailors continued to speak of Neptune, inheritor of Poseidon's mantle. Yet beneath artistic reinterpretation lies something older and less adorned: the human confrontation with instability. Poseidon embodies that confrontation. He is the reminder that beneath cultivated fields lies shifting ground, that beyond harbour walls stretches unpredictable expanse. That power, once unleashed, cannot be entirely contained. And yet, he is also the provider of fish, the bearer of trade routes, the source of springs that nourish crops. He is not solely destroyer, but sustainer. In returning to his deep origins, we see that his volatility mirrors natural cycles. Earthquakes reshape terrain but also create new landscapes. Storms devastate but replenish ecosystems. The sea erodes cliffs, yet deposits fertile silt elsewhere. Thus, Poseidon stands not simply as antagonist in heroic tales, but as ancient expression of ecological reality. As this chapter settles into stillness, imagine the Bronze Age coastline at dusk. No temple yet crowns the cliffs. No marble gleams. Only wind, surf, and perhaps a small gathering of worshippers offering grain or livestock to a power they feel but cannot see. The name may have sounded different then. Poseidon whispered into salt air, but the presence was the same. Before Olympus rose in story, before epics were sung, before tridents were sculpted in bronze, the deep already moved. And in that deep, the earliest shadow of Poseidon was waiting. There comes a time in every mythology when the gods grow quieter, not because their stories end, but because the world that once spoke to them in ritual begins to speak in different languages. The temples weather, the fires go cold. New prayers rise beneath new names. Yet even then, some presences do not vanish. They linger, not in sacrifice, but in symbol. Not in liturgy, but in memory. So it was with Poseidon. As centuries unfolded and the classical world shifted into the Hellenistic era, then into Roman dominion, the structure of belief transformed. The gods of Greece did not disappear overnight. They adapted, merged, were renamed. Poseidon became Neptune in Rome, less tempestuous in narrative tone, yet still sovereign of waters. Statues of him rose in fountains and forums. Sea battles were fought under his sign. Emperors claimed his favor, but beneath imperial grandeur, something subtle had changed. The older intimacy between landscape and divinity began to loosen. Philosophers increasingly sought natural explanations for storms and earthquakes. Thinkers examined wind patterns, celestial movement, and subterranean forces. Though the sea remained dangerous, its mysteries were gradually reframed. And yet, even as rational inquiry expanded, sailors still prayed. A ship leaving harbour at dusk does not care for philosophical abstraction. When waves rise black under a moonless sky, instinct reaches backward toward myth. The sea does not lose its voice because scholars reinterpret it. Throughout the Mediterranean, fishermen, traders, and soldiers continue to acknowledge the unpredictability of water. Offerings persisted, sometimes quietly. Shrines endured in coastal caves and remote promontories, long after official cults declined. Then came the slow rise of Christianity across the Roman world. The old gods were not defeated in battle, but dissolved through conversion and policy. Temples were abandoned or repurposed. Statues were buried, broken, or reinterpreted as allegory. Poseidon, like the others, retreated from worship into literature. But myth has a strange resilience. Medieval manuscripts preserved Homer. Renaissance artists revived classical imagery. Sculptors carved Neptune rising from fountains in Florence and Rome. Trident lifted high above cascading water. The god returned not as object of sacrifice, but as aesthetic embodiment of power. Painters depicted him amid crashing surf, beard streaming, muscles coiled in motion. Poets invoked him as metaphor for passion or fury. Navigators christened ships in his honor. Astronomers name planets and moons with inherited pantheon titles. Though in Greek tradition, the outermost planet would bear the Roman name Neptune rather than Poseidon. The sea itself remained unchanged. Storms still tore sails. Earthquakes still fractured coastlines. Tsunamis still erased villages in sudden, incomprehensible violence. Modern science provided explanation. Tectonic plates shifting, atmospheric pressure collapsing. But explanation does not erase awe. In this way, Poseidon survives not as literal belief, but as archetype. He represents the confrontation between humanity and forces beyond control. He stands at the threshold where ambition meets humility. Every harbour built, every lighthouse lit, every breakwater constructed is, in a sense, a dialogue with him. Even language preserves his echo. We describe markets as volatile, emotions as tempestuous, political shifts as seismic. The metaphors are ancient. They arise from the same impulse that once gave a trident to the shaking earth. Consider modern sailors navigating with satellite systems and steel hulls. Technology has reduced risk but not eliminated it. The ocean remains vast beyond comprehension. Cargo ships disappear in storms. Rogue waves rise unexpectedly. Submarines descend into crushing depths. In those depths, sunlight vanishes, pressure mounts, silence thickens. It is easy, even now, to imagine a palace beneath that darkness. Columns of coral, chambers lit by cold bioluminescent glow, a figure seated with trident resting beside him. Not because we believe it literally, but because the image expresses something enduring. Poseidon's mythology teaches patterns. When promises are broken, consequences ripple outward. When pride blinds, storms follow. When humility is learned, passage opens. These narrative arcs endure beyond religion. They are psychological truths shaped into divine biography. In epic, his wrath prolongs Odysseus' journey, forcing maturation. In civic myth, his rivalry with Athena defines competing visions of society. In archaic cult, his earthquakes remind communities of fragile foundations. He is not purely villain nor hero, he is condition. And what of the child swallowed by Cronus at the dawn of time? That image still resonates. Confinement followed by emergence, pressure followed by eruption. The sea itself mirrors this pattern. Tectonic plates compress until they release energy in sudden motion. Storm systems gather invisibly before unleashing wind. Poseidon's origin myth encodes geological truth long before geology existed as science. As we drift toward the close of his long story, it is fitting to return to the shoreline. Imagine standing alone at twilight. The horizon bleeds from gold to indigo. Waves fold gently against sand. There is no temple behind you, no priest chanting hymns, only wind and salt and the rhythmic breathing of tide. You know that beneath that surface lies vastness beyond sight. Entire ecosystems thrive in darkness. Mountains rise from ocean floors higher than those on land. Trenches plunge deeper than imagination. Ancient Greeks could not measure these depths, yet they sensed immensity. To give that immensity a name was not ignorance, it was reverence. Poseidon's trident may no longer be raised in worship, but the feeling that birthed it remains whenever we face the sea and recognize our smallness. In literature, he remains immortal. In art, he is forever poised, mid-strike. In metaphor, he lives wherever instability threatens certainty. And perhaps that is fitting, for the sea never settles permanently. It rests, then stirs. It glimmers, then darkens. It offers passage, then demands price. So too does the memory of Poseidon. He began as a swallowed child in the belly of fear. He rose as warrior in a war that reshaped the cosmos. He claimed the sea and shook the earth. He loved with force, fathered monsters and heroes, punished arrogance, and rewarded reverence. He stood at the margins of cities and at the center of storms. Now he stands in story, not diminished, but transformed. The tide recedes, but it always returns. And somewhere in the sound of waves against stone, if you listen long enough, you may still hear the faint echo of a trident striking deep below. Not as threat, but as reminder. The sea remembers. There is a final way to understand Poseidon, not only as a figure in myth, not only as a god once worshipped at windswept temples, but as a presence that endures within the architecture of human thought. For even when belief fades, symbols remain. The ancient Greeks lived in intimate proximity to uncertainty. Mountains divided their land into isolated valleys. The sea was both connection and abyss. Earthquakes arrived without warning. Storms erased fleets. In such a world, stability was never guaranteed. To survive required negotiation with forces larger than oneself. Poseidon became the face of that negotiation. But as civilizations expanded and knowledge grew, humanity began to chart the stars, measure coastlines, and calculate risk. Navigation improved. Shipbuilding advanced. Explanations for seismic tremors emerged through natural philosophy and later science. The divine personality behind these events receded, yet something curious happened. Even as rational frameworks replaced mythic causation, the language of Poseidon persisted. Writers speak of a storm of emotion, of waves of grief, of currents beneath the surface. These metaphors are not accidental. They arise from the same psychological terrain that once imagined a god stirring waters with a trident. The sea is not merely physical, it is internal. When anger surges unexpectedly, it feels tidal. When desire pulls against reason, it feels like undertow. When grief crashes over consciousness, it feels like drowning. Long before psychology named these states, myth gave them shape through gods. Poseidon's volatility reflects emotional truth. He is not measured like Athena, nor radiant with ordered clarity like Apollo. He is impulse, reaction, force. His anger at Odysseus mirrors the human tendency to hold resentment beyond proportion. His rivalry with other gods echoes pride that refuses to yield. Yet he is also necessary. Without the sea, there is stagnation. Without emotional depth, there is numbness. Poseidon's domain may be dangerous, but it is also fertile. Marine life flourishes unseen. Trade routes expand horizons. Heroes are forged through hardship upon waves. In this way, the sea god becomes archetype, a pattern recurring across cultures and eras. Many civilizations possess a storm or ocean deity embodying similar traits. The specifics differ, but the core symbolism endures. Humanity recognizes in water the reflection of its own instability and power. Even modern exploration of the ocean reveals how little we truly command it. Despite satellites and sonar, vast stretches remain uncharted. The deepest trenches crush steel and silence light. Entire ecosystems exist beyond human reach. In that darkness, imagination still wanders. The ancients envisioned coral palaces and tritons sounding shells. we envision submersibles descending through bioluminescent glow. The imagery changes. The awe does not. Poseidon's story also speaks to political and social realities. The sea has always been a site of migration, conflict, and exchange. Empires rise through naval dominance and fall when fleets sink. Control of waterways determines power. In antiquity, Athens' naval strength defined its golden age. In later centuries, maritime empires spanned continents. The sea remains both opportunity and risk. When we trace global trade routes across modern maps, lines curve over blue expanses, much as ancient sailors once traced them in memory. Cargo vessels carry goods across oceans still governed by storm systems and tectonic vulnerability. Poseidon, though no longer invoked in prayer, lives in every acknowledgement that control is partial. There is also the matter of climate, the slow, measurable rise of sea levels, the intensification of storms in certain regions. Science explains mechanisms, yet emotionally, humanity once again faces the vastness of water with a mixture of ambition and apprehension. If myth were being written anew, perhaps the sea god would not wield a bronze trident, but currents of warming tide. Perhaps his anger would manifest as shifting weather patterns, reminding us that imbalance invites response. Yet myth does not need literal revival to remain instructive. The Greeks understood that hubris precedes downfall. Odysseus' mistake was not survival, but boastfulness. King Minos' error was not desire for legitimacy, but refusal to honor promise. These lessons transcend theology. Poseidon punishes excess pride. He destabilizes those who assume mastery. In a world where technology fosters illusion of control, the sea continues to remind us of limits. And still, the sea invites wonder. At sunrise, water can lie smooth as polished bronze. At dusk, it reflects fire across its surface. Dolphins arc through foam. Children run along shores without fear. There is joy in proximity to vastness. Poseidon is not solely wrath, he is grandeur. Artists across centuries have returned to his figure precisely because he embodies sublime tension. Beauty intertwined with threat. The romantic painters of the 19th century captured shipwrecks beneath towering waves, not to celebrate destruction, but to express awe at scale beyond human measure. In literature, the sea often symbolizes journey into the unconscious. Characters set sail to discover not only distant lands, but hidden aspects of themselves. Odysseus' voyage is as much inward as outward. Each island tests character. Each storm strips illusion. Thus, Poseidon, in resisting him, becomes agent of transformation. It is tempting to reduce ancient gods to superstition surpassed by science. Yet to do so overlooks their enduring psychological resonance. They are narrative vessels carrying insight about fear, ambition, humility, and resilience. Poseidon's origin, swallowed by Cronus, reborn through upheaval, mirrors the cyclical nature of suppression and release within both geology and emotion. Pressure builds until rupture. Confinement precedes emergence. The titanomachy that freed him reflects generational change. The contest with Athena reflects civic identity. The wrath against Odysseus reflects personal growth through adversity. His mythology is not random collection, but coherent meditation on instability. As this long-telling approaches its quiet shore, imagine once more the ancient world in its prime. Bronze ships cutting across indigo water, marble temples gleaming on cliffs, poets singing under starlight of gods who shaped destiny. Now imagine the same sea today. Cargo ships and cruise liners, lighthouses blinking, satellites tracking storm systems from orbit. The surface has changed. The depth remains. If you stand at the water's edge at night and listen without distraction, the sound is timeless. It is the same rhythm heard by Mycenaean sailors, by Homeric bards, by Roman merchants, by medieval fishermen. That rhythm once carried a name spoken with reverence and fear: Poseidon. Not because waves required a bearded king to exist, but because human minds required a story to hold their power. And perhaps we still do. For when thunder rolls over open water and lightning fractures the horizon, when wind lashes spray against rock and the ground trembles faintly beneath your feet, there is a moment, brief, instinctive, when explanation yields to awe. In that moment, the old myths breathe again. The trident lifts, the sea answers. And though centuries have passed since incense burned in his temples, the Earthshaker remains where he has always been. Not confined to coral halls, not enthroned above Olympus, but present wherever water moves against stone, and reminds us that the world is larger than our certainty. The tide continues, and with it, the eternal story of the sea. There is a peculiar stillness that follows great turbulence, not the gentle calm of an ordinary day, but the profound quiet that comes after something vast has moved through the world and withdrawn. The sky clears, the sea settles, wreckage drifts, and those who remain stand in reflection, aware that they have witnessed power beyond measure. So it is with the story of Poseidon. We have followed him from the suffocating darkness within Cronus to the thunderous upheaval of the Titanomachy. We've seen him draw the sea by lot beside Zeus and Hades. We have watched him contest cities with Athena, build the walls of Troy, father heroes and monsters, and hound Odysseus across the wine-dark sea. We have traced his worship from Bronze Age tablets to windswept temples, from sacrificial altars to Renaissance fountains. Now what remains is not another storm, but an understanding. Poseidon endures because he is not merely a character in a sequence of events. He is a pattern. He is the embodiment of forces that shape both Earth and Psyche. His mythology encodes the Greek confrontation with instability, geographic, emotional, political. The Greeks did not imagine a universe of perfect order. Their cosmos was structured, yes, but dynamic. Even Olympus trembled at times. Gods quarreled. Fate constrained power. The sea was a fitting realm for a deity of such temperament, expansive, yet bounded, fertile, yet destructive, reflective, yet impenetrable. In studying Poseidon, we also study how ancient societies interpreted vulnerability. When ships vanished, when tremors split foundations, when coastal fields flooded, they did not shrug at randomness. They sought narrative coherence. They asked who had been angered, what vow neglected, what pride displayed. Modern thought may resist such personalization of natural forces, yet the impulse toward narrative remains deeply human. We still seek causes, patterns, accountability. We still feel outrage when disaster strikes unjustly. We still ask why. Poseidon's myths do not provide scientific explanation. They provide moral texture. When Odysseus boasts, storms follow. When Minos withholds sacrifice, consequences multiply. When respect is shown, safe passage is granted. The sea responds not arbitrarily, but relationally. even if we no longer believe the sea has intention, we recognize the wisdom embedded in those patterns. Arrogance in the face of danger increases risk. Neglect of balance invites disruption. Humility and preparation enhance survival. The sea has always demanded respect. And yet, there is also beauty in surrender. To float upon calm water beneath a vast sky is to experience a kind of liberation. Sailors speak of feeling both small and expansive at once. The horizon invites contemplation of infinity. Poseidon holds that paradox, terror and transcendence in one gesture. His trident is weapon, but also scepter. It strikes to destroy, but also to summon springs. His horses race across waves, not only in fury, but in majesty. His palace beneath the sea is not dungeon, but kingdom. The Greeks did not strip their gods of complexity. Poseidon is not redeemed from wrath, nor reduced to villainy. He remains fully himself, reactive, proud, necessary. And what of the end of gods? In one sense, there is no end. Myth does not expire, it transforms. The stories of Poseidon are still read, painted, adapted, retold. Films and novels reinterpret his figure. Children learn of sea gods long after temples have fallen. His name travels in language and literature. In another sense, his end came quietly, without cataclysm. No final battle removed him from dominion. Rather, belief thinned, ritual ceased, and memory took his place. But the sea never relinquished its power. Storm systems grow over warm waters and spin toward coasts. Tectonic plates grind slowly, storing energy for sudden release. Tides rise and fall according to lunar pull. These processes are described now through physics and geology, yet they evoke the same awe that once inspired prayer. If you stand upon a cliff at dusk and watch waves break below, you are participating in an experience unchanged for millennia. The language you use to describe it may differ, but the sensation remains, a recognition of scale beyond self. In that recognition, Poseidon still breathes, not as literal deity commanding storms by whim, but a symbol of the untamable within and without. There is also something profoundly human in his origin story. Swallowed at birth, confined in darkness, later reborn through upheaval, it is a myth of suppression and emergence, of power denied and reclaimed, of identity forged in pressure. The sea itself mirrors that arc. Beneath calm surfaces lie currents shaped by invisible forces. Beneath stable ground lie shifting plates. Beneath composed expression lie emotions capable of eruption. Poseidon teaches not repression, but awareness. The sea cannot be stilled forever. It can be navigated, respected, studied, but not owned. Perhaps that is his final lesson. Civilizations rise with confidence, build fleets, chart maps, extend dominion. Yet coastlines erode, empires fall, harbors silt, storms come without regard for ambition, and still humanity returns to the water. We build ships again. We sail again. We watch the horizon again. The Greeks once stood where we stand now and felt the same wind against their faces. They named the force before them. They shaped it into story so that it could be remembered and shared in the long hours after sunset. Tonight, as the story of Poseidon settles like foam upon shore, imagine the sound of distant surf in darkness. Not violent, not roaring, just steady. Each wave a breath, each breath a reminder. The Earthshaker does not need temples to exist in imagination. He does not need incense or sacrifice to shape metaphor. He lives wherever uncertainty meets courage, wherever pride meets consequence. Wherever vastness humbles certainty, the storm has passed. The sea lies quiet beneath stars. And somewhere beyond sight, not as tyrant, not as avenger, but as enduring presence, the spirit of Poseidon rests within the eternal rhythm of tide. The story ends where it began, with water. It moves, withdraws, returns, and it remembers. Long before Odysseus wandered, before the sea became a maze of punishment, before Ithaca faded into longing, there stood a city whose walls had once been shaped by divine hands. Troy. Its stones were not merely stacked by mortal masons. They were raised by Poseidon himself and by Apollo, compelled to serve King Laomedon either as punishment from Zeus or through divine agreement, depending on the telling. Imagine the sea god laboring, not in humiliation, but in contained force. His trident, which could shatter cliffs, now steadied stone. Each block fitted with precision, each wall rising in defiance of siege. The irony is immense. The very god who would later shake earth beneath cities once fortified one of the greatest among them. When the walls were complete, Laomedon refused payment, a mortal king attempting to cheat immortals. It is one of the most revealing patterns in Poseidon's myth. Broken oaths do not vanish into silence. They ferment, they return. In vengeance, Poseidon did not immediately topple Troy's defenses. Instead, he sent a sea-born terror, a monstrous creature rising from surf to devastate the Trojan coast. Crops failed, people perished. The sea turned from ally to predator. Only through sacrifice and the intervention of Heracles was the monster slain. Yet even then, Laomedon betrayed Heracles as well. The pattern of deception deepened, and Troy's doom was sealed long before Paris ever sailed for Sparta. By the time of the Great War immortalized in the Iliad, Poseidon's grievance simmered beneath the surface. During the Trojan War, the gods did not remain neutral observers. They chose sides, guided by old loyalties, rivalries and grudges. Poseidon favored the Achaeans, not out of affection alone, but memory. When the Trojans pressed hard against Greek ships, when Hector drove the assault to the water's edge, Poseidon rose from the sea in fury. Homer describes him striding across waves, the ocean parting beneath his immortal horses. The earth trembled under his steps. His voice thundered encouragement to Greek warriors. He infused them with courage when morale faltered. At times, Zeus forbade divine interference. And here, again, we glimpse the sea god's pride. Poseidon did not easily yield. Though bound by cosmic hierarchy, he defied when he deemed necessary. He supported the Greeks in secret, rallying them under disguise, unwilling to watch Troy triumph. His intervention during the war reveals something crucial. Poseidon is not purely destructive. He is partisan, strategic, capable of alliance. He values loyalty. He remembers insult. The image of him in battle is magnificent. Not the calm ruler of coral halls, but the earthshaker striding across blood-soaked sand, shaking spear and shield alike. The sea roared in sympathy. The shoreline became threshold between divine will and mortal courage. And yet, despite his power, he did not destroy Troy outright. Why? Because fate governed the outcome. Even gods operate within boundaries. The fall of Troy required mortal action. Achilles' rage, Hector's courage, Odysseus' cunning. Poseidon influenced momentum, but did not erase destiny. There is restraint in this. He could shake the walls he once built, He could summon waves high enough to drown the fleet, but the epic demanded human agency. The gods amplify, they do not replace. After Troy finally burned, Poseidon's relationship with the returning Greek heroes varied. Some he aided, others he punished. The sea became testing ground for each man's character. In this way, the Trojan War represents a convergence point in his mythology. Old grievances resurfaced, divine alliances shifted, mortals bore consequences of ancient promises broken generations earlier. And beneath it all, the sea remained constant, lapping against Trojan shores before war, roaring during battle, carrying ships away after ruin. Poseidon is not merely participant in the Trojan saga, he is its environmental pulse. Without the sea, there is no abduction of Helen. Without ships, no invasion. Without storms, no scattered homecomings. Without him, the epic shrinks. He is the medium through which the war expands beyond city walls. As night falls over the ruins of Troy, smoke rising into dark sky, waves continue their motion. The walls he once built crumble in flame. The sea reflects firelight. Does he feel vindication? Myth does not say, but it suggests something subtler. The divine memory is long, and the balance of honor, once disturbed, echoes through generations. And so we move forward. The war has ended, but the sea is not finished. 5 to 7 chapters remain before we reach full 4-hour-length immersion. Next, we descend into the genealogy of heroes, the bloodline of Poseidon woven through kings and monsters alike. The tide is not yet done. Long after cities fall and wars fade into ash, blood endures. Not the red stain upon sand, but the invisible inheritance carried through generations. Temperament, strength, pride, restlessness. In Greek myth, lineage is never incidental. To know a hero's father is to understand his fate. And the sons and daughters of Poseidon move through myth like living currents, each bearing some reflection of the sea's force within them. If Zeus fathered kings who ruled with thunderous authority, and Apollo fathered figures of clarity and prophecy, Poseidon fathered those who carried turbulence in their wake. Among the most compelling is Theseus. Though raised as the son of Aegeus, king of Athens, Theseus in many traditions was also claimed as a child of Poseidon. His mother Aethra, according to the myth, lay with Aegeus and with Poseidon on the same night. Thus Theseus carried dual paternity, mortal and divine, land and sea intertwined. This duality shaped him. Theseus's life is marked by journeys, by confrontation with monsters, by acts that consolidate civilization out of chaos. He slays bandits along the road to Athens, imposing order. He descends into Crete to face the Minotaur, a creature whose existence traces back to Poseidon's wrath against Minos. There is poetic symmetry here. The sea god's anger gives rise to the Minotaur. His son destroys it. The bloodline corrects what the divine temper initiated. Theseus is often remembered for unifying Attica under Athenian rule, a political act reflecting cohesion from fragmentation. Perhaps in this, we see a subtle reconciliation between Poseidon and Athens, the city that once chose Athena over him. Through Theseus, the sea god's lineage becomes foundational to Athenian identity. Yet Theseus's life also reflects instability. His abandonment of Ariadne, his entanglement with Phaedra, his later misjudgments, all echo emotional turbulence. even heroes born of the sea are not immune to its unpredictability. Another figure shaped by Poseidon's blood is Bellerophon. Bellerophon, though often described as son of Glaucus, is in some accounts fathered by Poseidon. He tames Pegasus, the winged horse born from Poseidon's union with Medusa. The symbolism deepens. The sea god sires both the horse and the hero who masters it. Bellerophon rides Pegasus to defeat the Chimera, a fire-breathing hybrid monster. For a time, he embodies triumph over chaos, but pride overtakes him. Attempting to ascend to Olympus itself, he falls from favor, cast down to wander in isolation. The lesson repeats. Hubris invites descent. The sea god's lineage carries greatness and danger. Then, there is the giant Antaeus, son of Poseidon and Gaia. Antaeus draws strength from contact with Earth. Each time he is thrown down, he rises renewed, until Heracles lifts him from the ground and crushes him mid-air. In Antaeus, we see raw elemental inheritance, sea and earth united in brute resilience. Yet without wisdom, such force becomes tyranny. Poseidon's children often blur the boundary between human and monstrous. Polyphemus, the Cyclops blinded by Odysseus, reflects isolation and savagery. He is pastoral yet violent, a being untethered to civic order. His suffering at Odysseus's hands ignites the sea god's most famous vengeance. Chrysaor, brother to Pegasus, becomes ancestor to figures of heroic renown. Triton, son of Amphitrite, serves as herald of the sea. His conch shell becomes instrument of both alarm and reassurance. And then there are lesser-known descendants scattered across local myths. Kings who trace their legitimacy to Poseidon. Founders of coastal cities claiming divine ancestry. Regional heroes whose strength or temperament marks them as children of the deep. Genealogy in Greek myth is not random storytelling. It reflects political identity. To claim descent from Poseidon was to align oneself with maritime strength, with ancient authority older than Olympus. In Corinth, where the Isthmian Games honored him, local rulers linked themselves symbolically to the sea god. In islands across the Aegean, fishing communities told stories of descent from him, binding survival to sacred lineage. Yet Poseidon's bloodline is rarely serene. His children struggle. They conquer and fall. They achieve glory and suffer downfall. They reflect the sea's oscillation between calm and storm. Even Theseus, triumphant slayer of the Minotaur, ultimately meets a tragic end, exiled and killed on foreign soil. The sea does not guarantee stability to its own progeny. What does this suggest? Perhaps that power inherited without balance is volatile. Poseidon's children inherit force, not necessarily foresight. They must learn restraint or face collapse. There is also the theme of testing. Heroes born of Poseidon often encounter water as proving ground. They cross seas, confront monsters near coasts, rely on navigation between islands. The ocean becomes rite of passage. In this way, the bloodline reinforces domain. The father's realm shapes the child's destiny. One cannot speak of Poseidon's descendants without acknowledging their role in shaping broader myth cycles. Through Theseus, the myth of Athens emerges. Through Bellerophon, the taming of Pegasus connects sky and sea. Through Polyphemus, the Odyssey gains its central antagonist. Through Antaeus, Heracles' labours expand into confrontation with elemental strength. The sea god's legacy is not isolated. It threads through the tapestry of Greek myth. And yet, beneath genealogies and heroic arcs lies something more intimate. Children mirror parents. Poseidon's temper, quick to offense, powerful in reaction, surfaces in his offspring. His grandeur surfaces too. Physical strength, courage, capacity for endurance. But without measured wisdom, these traits tip into recklessness. The Greeks, through these stories, explored inheritance not as guarantee, but as challenge. To be son of a god is not to be secure. It is to carry weight. Imagine the shoreline at dawn. A young hero stands at the water's edge, knowing he carries divine blood. The horizon calls him outward, but beyond that horizon lie storms. He must decide how to sail. Thus the chapter closes not with triumph, but with recognition. Poseidon's lineage is vast, scattered across islands and epics. Some of his children build cities, some terrorize them, some rise on winged horses, some fall into obscurity. All carry within them the echo of waves. And somewhere beneath the surface, the Father watches, not intervening always, not rescuing always, but present in current and tide. The blood of the sea flows on, and still, chapters remain. We move next into the sacred geography of earthquakes and coastal curses, where land itself remembers the strike of the trident. The Earthshaker has more to reveal. Before instruments could measure magnitude, before fault lines were mapped beneath continents, there was only the sudden violence of motion. The ground would groan, walls would crack, stone temples would shudder as though struck by an invisible hammer. And in the ancient Greek imagination, that hammer belonged to Poseidon. He was not only lord of waves, but Enosigaios, the Earthshaker. To modern minds, sea and earthquake seem separate domains, yet the Greeks understood something intuitively true. The same deep forces that stir oceans also unsettle land. Subterranean waters were believed to flow beneath the crust, connecting springs to seas in hidden channels. When the earth trembled, it was because the god had struck his trident against bedrock or shifted beneath the surface in anger or warning. In a landscape as seismically active as Greece, this was not poetic exaggeration, but lived theology. Consider the Peloponnese, fractured terrain, coastal cities perched along fault lines. Consider islands in the Aegean rising from volcanic arcs. The earth there is not still, it is restless. Temples dedicated to Poseidon often stood near such unstable ground. Not because it was safe, but because it was meaningful. At the Isthmus of Corinth, where land narrows and tectonic pressures concentrate, his sanctuary overlooked both seas. Ships were hauled across the narrow strip to avoid treacherous southern waters. The land itself felt like a hinge between worlds. There, athletes competed in his honor during the Isthmian Games, even as tremors occasionally reminded spectators of deeper forces below. Earthquakes were interpreted not merely as anger, but as communication. If a city had neglected ritual, failed to uphold sacred promises, or descended into arrogance, the trembling ground might be read as divine correction. Even when no moral cause was obvious, the event reinforced humility. Stability, the Greeks knew, was provisional. One of the most haunting myths linked to seismic fury involves the city of Helike in Achaia. Though recorded by later writers centuries after the classical period, the story tells of Helike's destruction by earthquake and tsunami in 373 BCE. The The city sank beneath the sea after its inhabitants allegedly angered Poseidon by mistreating refugees or failing to honor his cult. Modern archaeology confirms that Helike was indeed destroyed by seismic activity and submerged. In antiquity, this catastrophe was remembered as divine retribution. The sea swallowed streets, columns lay beneath salt water. For generations, fishermen claimed to glimpse ruins beneath the surface. Here, myth and geology converge. Poseidon did not merely send waves, he erased a city. Even beyond Helike, countless coastal settlements bore scars of seismic events. Each tremor reinforced the god's epithet. Each collapsed building served as a reminder that stone, however solid, rests upon shifting foundations. The trident became symbol not only of maritime dominion, but tectonic authority. In art, Poseidon's stance often conveys downward force, as though he might at any moment drive his weapon into earth. Unlike Zeus's lightning, which descends from sky, Poseidon's power radiates upward from below. This distinction matters. Lightning can be seen forming in storm clouds. Earthquakes give no warning. The violence originates beneath the feet of those who believe themselves secure. There is something profoundly unsettling about that. The Greeks understood vulnerability in architectural terms. Temples were built with precision, columns aligned in harmonic ratios. Yet no design could guarantee permanence against seismic upheaval. In this way, Poseidon represented the fragility of human achievement, but he was not worshipped solely to prevent destruction. Springs were attributed to his trident as well. In the contest with Athena for Athens, he struck the Acropolis and produced a saltwater well. Though Athenians chose Athena's olive tree, the well remained a sacred site, its waters echoing faintly during storms. Across Greece, sacred springs marked places where Poseidon's power had touched earth. Fresh water emerging unexpectedly from rock was miracle and necessity. In agricultural societies, such springs sustained life. Thus, the Earthshaker was also water-bringer. He could split land in fury or open it in nourishment. The ambiguity reflects natural truth. Tectonic shifts can devastate, but they also create mountains, fertile valleys, geothermal springs. Destruction and creation are intertwined processes. In mythic imagination, this duality became personal. Poseidon did not shake Earth arbitrarily. He responded to oath-breaking, to disrespect, to imbalance. The trembling ground became moral theatre, and yet there are no myths suggesting he enjoyed destruction for its own sake. He is reactive, not chaotic. His anger is provoked, his power is deliberate. This perspective offered comfort. If earthquakes were divine, they were at least comprehensible within relational framework. One could appease a god. One could rebuild a temple. One could restore ritual balance. Randomness offers no such dialogue. As Greek thought evolved, philosophers such as Aristotle proposed natural explanations for earthquakes, suggesting winds trapped underground or shifts in subterranean matter. These ideas marked early attempts to detach seismic events from divine personality. But even then, common belief did not immediately shift. Ritual and reason coexisted. Imagine a tremor striking at dusk. Citizens flee into open fields. Dust clouds rise from fallen masonry. The aftershocks ripple faintly. In the hours that follow, priests gather to interpret omens. Was sacrifice neglected? Was arrogance displayed? Or was this simply the god reminding mortals of his presence? The sea might appear calm that same evening. Waves gliding beneath starlight as though nothing had happened. Yet inland, foundations lie cracked. Poseidon's reach extends unseen. This unseen aspect reinforces his psychological resonance. Much like buried emotion, tectonic force accumulates silently until release. What appears stable may conceal stress lines beneath. The Greeks did not articulate plate tectonics, but through myth, they recognized pressure and rupture as natural patterns. And so, they honored the earth-shaker not only with fear, but with respect. Temples built in his name were sometimes reconstructed after earthquakes, stronger, yet still vulnerable. The act of rebuilding was itself ritual, acknowledgement that stability requires resilience. Today, seismographs measure tremors precisely. Fault lines are mapped. Engineers design buildings to flex rather than shatter. Yet earthquakes still remind us that mastery is partial. When the ground moves, instinct overrides theory. There is a moment, brief, instinctive, when the ancient reflex awakens, a feeling that something vast beneath awareness has stirred. In that moment, even modern minds sense what the Greeks named Poseidon. Not because we attribute causation to him, but because his myth captured the emotional reality of living upon a restless planet. He is the embodiment of instability that cannot be eliminated, only navigated. As this chapter draws to a close, imagine the earth quiet again after trembling. Dust settles, the sea continues its rhythm. Survivors gather among ruins, not in despair, alone, but in recognition that life persists. The earth shaker has passed, but he remains. Not always striking, not always furious, sometimes merely shifting, reminding, and somewhere beneath stone and sand, beneath harbours and hills, beneath sleeping cities and ancient ruins, the deep holds its breath once more. 4 to 5 substantial chapters remain to complete full 4-hour immersion. Next, we will descend into the darker waters, the sea monsters, coastal curses, and the symbolic terrors that rise when Poseidon's domain turns against humanity. The tide is not finished yet. There is something about the open sea at night that unsettles even the most rational mind. The horizon vanishes. Depth becomes immeasurable. Sound travels strangely across water. What moves beneath the surface remains unseen. For the ancient Greeks, that unseen realm did not lie empty. It stirred. And in the imagination, shaped by the dominion of Poseidon, the depths were alive with beings born of salt and shadow. Creatures that embodied the fears sailors dared not name while standing on deck beneath the moonless sky. The sea was not merely distance, it was possibility. Of shipwreck, of disappearance, of sudden violence rising from below. Among the most famous of these terrors is Scylla, who lurked in the narrow strait, opposite Charybdis. Though not always described as Poseidon's direct offspring, she belongs to his domain, an extension of maritime danger. In the Odyssey, Odysseus must navigate between her snapping heads and the whirlpool of Charybdis, losing men either way. Scylla represents unavoidable loss. Charybdis represents devouring chaos. A whirlpool that swallows ships whole before belching wreckage back to the surface. These are not random monsters. They are narrative expressions of maritime reality. Narrow straits are dangerous. Whirlpools exist. Rocks jut beneath waves. Sailors must choose routes knowing risk cannot be eliminated. Poseidon does not always need to appear directly. His presence is implicit wherever the sea threatens. Then there is the sea monster, sent against Troy in vengeance for Laomedon's broken promise, a creature rising from surf to demand sacrifice. It is eventually slain by Heracles, yet its existence reveals how coastal cities understood vulnerability. The ocean could produce something vast and hostile without warning. Another chilling figure is Cetus, the monster to which Andromeda was chained before being rescued by Perseus. Though Cetus is not always directly described as Poseidon's creation, it operates within his watery dominion. It is sent as punishment when Queen Cassiopeia boasts that her daughter surpasses the Nereids in beauty. Offense to sea deities invites maritime catastrophe. Here again the theme repeats. Hubris leads to rising waters. The sea becomes instrument of correction. Even creatures not explicitly monstrous, like the sirens, belong to the perilous ecology of Poseidon's realm. Their song lures sailors to wreck upon hidden rocks. In the Odyssey, Odysseus survives their call only by binding himself to the mast, restraining desire through foresight. The monsters of the deep are not merely beasts, they are tests. They represent temptation, pride, ignorance, and fear, externalized. Consider also the hippocamps, half horse, half fish creatures drawing Poseidon's chariot. They are not monstrous in hostility, yet they blur boundaries between land and sea. Their existence suggests that within Poseidon's domain, categories dissolve. Land animals acquire fins. Sea creatures grow human torsos. Stability becomes fluid. Tritons, Nereids, sea nymphs all populate the deep in a spectrum ranging from benevolent to unpredictable. Some guide ships, others mislead them. The Greeks did not imagine the ocean as uniform evil. It was alive, diverse, layered, ambiguous. Even the figure of Polyphemus, son of Poseidon, straddles monstrous and pastoral identity. He tends sheep, sings to Galatea, and yet devours men. His cave sits near the shore, threshold between land and sea. His single eye symbolizes limited perception, brute strength without wisdom. When Odysseus blinds him, the monster becomes vulnerable. Yet his prayer to Poseidon unleashes consequences far greater than his own violence. In this way, the monstrous offspring of the sea god are not isolated threats, but nodes in a web of cause and effect. Sea monsters often emerge in response to insult. This is significant. They are not random predators. They are summoned manifestations of imbalance. In an age without maritime charts, underwater topography remained mysterious. Shoals and reefs could tear hulls open. Strange marine animals surfaced unexpectedly. Bioluminescent creatures flickered in dark waters. The line between imagination and observation was thin. Rather than deny mystery, Greek myth embraced it. If something vast rose from below, it had story behind it. Even storms were personified. Winds were given names. But while Zeus commanded lightning, the sea itself belonged to Poseidon. When storms struck ships mid-voyage, it was his domain convulsing. In later artistic traditions, painters depicted shipwrecks with towering waves and struggling sailors, visual echoes of Homeric narrative. The ocean became canvas for existential reflection. But for ancient mariners, monsters were not metaphor alone. They were explanatory frameworks for risk beyond control. If a ship vanished without trace, perhaps a sea serpent had dragged it below. If a coastal village disappeared after tidal surge, perhaps a monstrous wave had risen in anger. Today, we speak of rogue waves, underwater earthquakes triggering tsunamis, massive squid dwelling in deep trenches. Science demystifies without diminishing awe. The Greeks, lacking such data, transformed awe into narrative. Poseidon's monsters serve another purpose as well. They define heroism. Without Scylla and Charybdis, Odysseus's cunning loses urgency. Without the sea monster threatening Andromeda, Perseus lacks occasion for rescue. Without the Cretan bull, Theseus lacks trial. Monsters create boundary conditions within which courage emerges. In this sense, Poseidon's darker creations are catalysts. They do not exist solely to destroy, but to test. Yet, the cost of those tests is real. Sailors die, cities flood, heroes lose companions, the sea demands tribute. There is an emotional honesty in this mythology. It does not promise safety. It promises challenge. Imagine an ancient trireme navigating a narrow strait at dusk. The rowers strain. The helmsman scans darkening waters. Beneath the hull, currents twist unpredictably. The crew remembers tales of monsters lurking nearby. Fear sharpens attention. The myth heightens vigilance. And when safe passage is achieved, gratitude deepens. Poseidon's realm, then, is not simply terror but heightened awareness of fragility. In the modern world, we have mapped coastlines and charted reefs. We know that whirlpools form through tidal interaction and underwater geography. We understand that giant waves can result from distant storms. Yet even with knowledge, standing at sea in heavy weather evokes primal response. The deck tilts, wind howls, the horizon disappears. In such moments, ancient names feel less distant. The monsters of the deep may no longer bear serpentine forms in our imagination, but the sensation of vulnerability remains unchanged. Poseidon's mythology preserved that sensation in story. As this chapter settles into stillness, imagine descending beneath the surface, far below sunlight, into cold blue darkness. Strange shapes drift, pressure builds, silence becomes immense. It is easy, even now, to feel that something sovereign inhabits such depth. Not necessarily a bearded god with trident raised, but a presence, vast, indifferent, powerful. The Greeks gave that presence a face, and through monsters, they gave it voice. 3 to 4 major chapters remain to reach full immersive length. Next, we will move into the maritime empires and the philosophical reinterpretation of Poseidon in later antiquity. How he transitioned from living deity to symbol within changing worlds. The sea still rolls forward, and we follow. There comes a moment in every civilization when its gods begin to change. Not because they weaken, but because the world around them does. Trade routes widen. Empires stretch beyond familiar shores. Philosophers ask questions that priests once answered without hesitation. Language evolves. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, divinity shifts from presence to metaphor. So it was with Poseidon. In the height of the classical Greek world, he was still invoked with sincerity. Sailors sacrificed before departure. Athletes competed in the Isthmian Games in his honor. Earthquakes were felt as his movement beneath the land. His temples stood white against blue horizons. But as the Hellenistic age unfolded after the campaigns of Alexander, the Greek world expanded beyond the Aegean into Egypt, Persia, and farther east. Cultural exchange accelerated. Gods were compared, merged, equated. Religious syncretism became common. Poseidon found parallels in foreign sea deities. his identity blended with broader Mediterranean maritime symbolism. When Rome rose to dominance, he was absorbed into the Roman pantheon as Neptune. The transformation was not erasure, but adaptation. Neptune retained trident and horses, but his narrative intensity softened. Roman religion emphasized civic order and imperial authority. Neptune became patron of naval power, rather than personal avenger of wounded pride. In Rome, monumental fountains and mosaics depicted him with regal composure. The storms of Homer grew quieter in official iconography. Empire preferred stability. Yet beyond state religion, philosophical currents flowed. Thinkers such as Plato and Aristotle approached natural phenomena through reason. Earthquakes were theorized as subterranean winds or shifts in matter. Tides were linked to celestial bodies. The divine personality behind such events became less necessary as explanatory framework. Still, myth persisted in education and literature. The epics remained central to cultural identity. Children learned of Odysseus's trials and the wrath of the sea god. Artists sculpted him mid-stride, muscles coiled, beard streaming. He did not vanish, he transformed. As centuries turned and Christianity spread through the Roman world, the Olympian gods retreated from formal worship. Temples were abandoned or repurposed. Sacred fires extinguished. Sacrifices ceased. Poseidon's sanctuaries fell silent. But silence does not equal absence. His image endured in art, preserved in manuscripts, revived in Renaissance imagination centuries later. Painters such as Botticelli and sculptors across Europe drew upon classical mythology, a symbolic language. Neptune, rising from the sea, became emblem of raw natural force and aesthetic grandeur. The god once feared for literal storms became metaphor for passion, upheaval, and sublime power. And yet, the sea remained unchanged. Storms did not soften because theology shifted. Earthquakes did not cease because philosophers theorized. Mariners still faced peril crossing open waters. Coastal towns still braced for surging tides. Human understanding evolved. Vulnerability did not. In this evolving world, Poseidon became something subtler, an archetype embedded in culture. He appeared in poetry as symbol of uncontrollable emotion. He surfaced in political rhetoric when describing turbulent times. He stood in sculpture as reminder of ancient heritage. Even language preserved him indirectly. Words like seismic, tempestuous, turbulent carry echoes of the forces he embodied. To describe a leader as stormy is to invoke maritime imagery rooted in ancient myth. By the Renaissance, classical gods were no longer worshipped but admired. They represented humanistic engagement with nature and antiquity. Poseidon, trident raised above sculpted fountains, became aesthetic celebration rather than object of sacrifice. Yet there is something enduring about the sea that resists full domestication into metaphor. Despite satellites and weather models, oceans remain vast and partially unknowable. The deepest trenches plunge beyond sunlight into crushing darkness. Entire ecosystems thrive beyond human sight. Undersea earthquakes still trigger tsunamis, capable of reshaping coastlines in hours. Modern science names mechanisms. It does not erase awe. Stand before a hurricane viewed from orbit. Spiraling cloud mass larger than nations. Watch waves during a storm batter concrete piers until they fracture. Feel the earth tremble unexpectedly beneath your feet. In those moments, myth feels less distant, not because we attribute causation to a trident-bearing deity, but because we recognize the ancient impulse to personify magnitude. Poseidon's evolution from god to memory mirrors humanity's own maturation. We no longer require divine narrative to explain natural phenomena, yet we continue to use narrative to interpret emotional and existential experience. He has shifted from external ruler to internal symbol, and perhaps that is the final transformation of gods. They begin as explanations for what we cannot measure. They become companions in art and story. They endure as metaphors for what we still struggle to master within ourselves. The sea inside the human mind, the depths of anger, the pull of longing, the surge of grief, remains as mysterious as any ancient abyss. Poseidon, as symbol, helps articulate that depth. When Odysseus wandered, it was not only across geography but across psyche. The storms he faced externalized internal reckoning. The sea's resistance shaped his character. We continue to tell such stories because they reflect lived experience. The world changes. Empires rise and fall. Temples crumble. Beliefs transform. But the sea continues its rhythm, indifferent to theology, yet profoundly woven into human imagination. And so Poseidon stands at the edge of history, no longer enthroned in active worship, yet never entirely gone. He has receded like tide, revealing new intellectual shorelines. But beneath those shorelines, the same water waits. 2 or 3 final chapters remain to complete full immersive length. A closing philosophical meditation, interwoven with a return to the beginning, bringing the narrative full circle. The tide slows now, but it has not yet reached its final shore. There is something about the horizon that has always unsettled and inspired humanity in equal measure. It is a line that promises distance but denies clarity. It invites movement, yet conceals what lies beyond. For the ancient Greeks, that shifting edge between sky and water belonged to Poseidon, not as territory alone, but as threshold. A threshold between safety and risk, between the known and the unknowable, between land, where footsteps leave marks, and sea, where every trace vanishes. To understand Poseidon fully, we must see him not only as ruler of waves or shaker of earth, not only as father of heroes and sender of monsters, but as guardian of the horizon itself, the boundary that forever recedes. The Greeks were not a people of endless plains. Their world was mountainous, fractured into valleys separated by ridges. Travel by land was slow, often perilous. The sea, paradoxically, unified them. Ships connected cities faster than roads could. Trade, diplomacy, war, all moved across blue expanse. Yet that same expanse swallowed fleets. Thus the horizon became paradox, connection and annihilation in one line. Poseidon embodies that paradox. He does not promise calm waters. He promises movement. He does not guarantee arrival. He guarantees journey. Consider how many Greek myths depend upon departure. Jason sails in search of the golden fleece. Odysseus wanders for a decade. Theseus crosses to Crete. Bellerophon flies above land and sea. Even Heracles must navigate coasts and islands in his labours. The sea is rarely final destination. It is passage, and passage transforms. When a ship leaves harbour, those on board surrender certainty. Wind direction shifts. Currents intervene. The crew must adapt or perish. In this sense, Poseidon governs change itself. His waters refuse stagnation. Even tides remind of cyclical return. advance and retreat, approach and withdraw. Nothing remains fixed. The Greeks understood impermanence deeply. Cities rose in brilliance and fell into ruin. Alliances formed and dissolved. Earthquakes erased generations of architecture. The sea both facilitated empire and hastened its collapse. Athens' naval supremacy in the 5th century, BCE, for instance, relied entirely on mastery of waters under Poseidon's symbolic domain. Triremes cut through the Aegean with disciplined precision, yet maritime power bred ambition. War with Sparta followed. The Peloponnesian War ravaged the Greek world. Plague, defeat, and internal strife reshaped history. The sea that once empowered Athens also contributed to its vulnerability. Thus, Poseidon is not partisan in the long arc of time. He grants opportunity and exacts cost. Even beyond Greece, maritime expansion defined later empires. Rome, Byzantium, Venice, Spain, Britain. Oceans carried wealth and conquest across continents. They also swallowed armadas in storms and battle. The pattern persists across millennia. The sea invites ambition. It tests it. In art, the horizon line often represents hope or transcendence. Ships sail toward glowing sunsets. Explorers set course toward unseen continents. Yet beyond romantic imagery lies relentless reality. Water does not care for intention. Poseidon's mythology reminds us that vast systems operate beyond individual desire. And yet, there is beauty in that surrender. Stand upon a cliff overlooking open water at dusk. The sky deepens into violet. Waves catch fading light like molten metal. Gulls drift on wind currents. The rhythmic breathing of surf steadies thought. In that moment, anxiety dissolves into perspective. Human struggles feel small against such scale. Perhaps this is why the sea has always inspired contemplation. Philosophers walked along shores. Poets listened to waves. The infinite horizon invites reflection on mortality and continuity. Poseidon, as archetype, becomes figure of that infinity. He is older than cities, older than walls, older than memory of any one generation. He was present when Bronze Age sailors ventured cautiously along coastlines. He was present when Homer's verses first echoed around fires. He was present when Roman fleets dominated the Mediterranean. He was present when Renaissance painters resurrected his image. He is present now, though no temple bears active sacrifice. Because the sea is present. And as long as the sea moves, the idea of Poseidon remains intelligible. In modern times, we send submarines to explore trenches miles deep. We deploy satellites to predict storms. We build oil rigs anchored to ocean floors. We lay communication cables across abyssal plains to connect continents digitally. Yet accidents still happen. Platforms collapse, ships sink, storms intensify unpredictably. Tectonic plates shift beneath coastal cities. Tsunamis rise without mercy. Control is never complete. The horizon remains. The final understanding of Poseidon may not lie in literal belief or artistic representation, but in acceptance. Acceptance that some forces exceed mastery. Acceptance that pride must bow before scale. Acceptance that journey defines life more than destination. Odysseus did not return unchanged. The sea stripped him of companions, illusions, arrogance. By the time he reached Ithaca, he carried humility forged through hardship. So too, humanity's relationship with nature evolves through confrontation and adaptation. Poseidon's trident no longer strikes in mythic literalism, yet tectonic plates still collide. Storms still gather over warm waters. Waves still carve cliffs, grain by grain. The Earthshaker has not vanished. He has become process rather than person. And perhaps that is fitting. For at the beginning of this long story, we met a child swallowed by fear, confined within the body of a tyrant, waiting in darkness. From that darkness emerged force that would shape oceans and narratives alike. At the end, we find not a throne in coral halls, but a horizon stretching endlessly outward. The sea does not conclude. It continues. Its tides do not resolve. They return. Poseidon's story, like the water he governs, has no final shore, only rhythm. There is one final chapter left to bring this journey fully home. A closing meditation that returns us to the beginning, weaving origin, wrath, worship, and memory into one final, quiet tide. The horizon remains before us, and the sea is still moving. Before there was a horizon, before ships carved white scars into blue water, before temples rose on cliffs and poets shaped thunder into syllables, there was only pressure. Sky pressed upon earth, darkness pressed upon light, time pressed forward without witness, and within that pressure, the first stories formed. Poseidon began not as a storm, not as a ruler, not even as a sea god, but as a child swallowed whole by fear. Cast into the belly of Cronus, he knew confinement before he knew tide. He knew darkness before horizon. Perhaps that is why his domain would later be vast. Perhaps that is why nothing in his nature accepts stillness for long. From imprisonment, he rose into war. The Titanomachy, shaking cosmos into new order. From war, he drew the sea by lot beside Zeus and Hades. From the sea, he shaped storms, earthquakes, horses, monsters, heroes, and through every act, vengeance, rivalry, love, pride, intervention, one pattern remained constant: movement. The sea does not freeze in narrative. It surges, retreats, crashes, calms. Poseidon mirrors that rhythm. He is not static morality. He is force responding to force. When Laomedon broke his oath, waves rose. When Odysseus boasted, storms followed. When cities forgot reverence, the earth trembled. But when sailors prayed with humility, winds eased. When athletes competed in honor, games flourished. When heroes endured without arrogance, passage opened. The Greeks did not imagine a universe of passive divinity. Their gods were engaged, reactive, alive within natural processes. And Poseidon was among the most immediate, because water and ground are immediate. You feel them beneath your feet. You see them stretching before your eyes. You cannot escape them. Even now, long after incense faded from his sanctuaries, his presence lingers wherever waves meet land. Stand at the edge of the ocean at dawn. The world is hushed. The first light brushes the surface. Each wave folds inward, then dissolves. There is no anger in it, no roar, only rhythm. That rhythm has continued uninterrupted since long before myth. It continued when Bronze Age sailors whispered his name in Linear B script. It continued when Homer sang of his wrath in the Odyssey. It continued when philosophers sought natural causes. It continued when temples fell and new religions rose. The sea does not depend on belief, but belief depends on the sea. For it was in watching waves that humans first grasped scale beyond themselves. In hearing surf at night, that they sensed permanence beyond individual life. In feeling the ground tremble that they understood fragility, Poseidon was the shape they gave that understanding. He is anger without apology. He is beauty without guarantee. He is power without permanence. He fathers heroes who struggle and monsters who terrify. He builds walls and shakes them down. He grants safe harbor and wrecks fleets. He is contradiction held together by water, and water remembers everything. Every shipwreck becomes sediment. Every storm leaves reshaped coastline. Every drowned city rests somewhere beneath silt and silence. Even Helika, swallowed by earthquake and wave, lingered beneath the sea for centuries, memory preserved in salt. There is a quiet wisdom in that. Nothing truly disappears. It transforms. The same is true of gods. Poseidon no longer commands sacrifice, yet he commands metaphor. He no longer shakes earth by conscious will, yet the earth still shakes. He no longer rides hippocamps across mythic foam, yet currents still carry life across oceans. He is moved from literal deity to eternal symbol, and symbols do not die. They adapt. In times of personal upheaval, when emotions surge without warning, we still describe them as tidal. When political climates shift violently, we call them seismic. When grief overwhelms, we speak of drowning. We are still using his language, because we are still living within his element, the sea inside the human mind, the depth of fear, longing, ambition, fury, remains as vast as any ocean trench. We navigate it imperfectly. Sometimes we boast and invite storm. Sometimes we endure and reach shore humbled. Odysseus' journey was never about defeating Poseidon. It was about surviving him. And survival required transformation. Perhaps that is the final truth of the sea god story. You do not conquer the ocean. You learn to move with it. You do not silence earthquakes. You build resilient foundations. You do not banish storms. You read the wind and adjust your sails. The Greeks understood this deeply. Their myths were not escapism. They were instruction wrapped in poetry. Poseidon teaches respect for scale. He teaches humility before instability. He teaches that strength without restraint becomes destruction. And he teaches that movement, even painful, even prolonged, shapes character. At the end of all stories, what remains? Not palaces of coral, not tridents of bronze, not even epic verses echoing in amphitheaters. What remains is water, waves breaking against stone long after names fade. If you listen closely, in that breaking, you might hear faint echoes. Not words, but cadence. The cadence of ancient hymns, the cadence of oars striking rhythm, the cadence of sailors whispering prayers before dawn departure. The sea does not answer in language. It answers in motion. And so, we return to where we began. A child swallowed by darkness. A god emerging into war. A ruler claiming horizon. A force shaping heroes. A memory dissolving into symbol. The first wave, the last, they are the same wave. It rises, it falls, it rises again, and somewhere in that endless rhythm, beyond worship and beyond forgetting, the presence once called Poseidon continues, not as figure seated upon a throne, but as the living pulse of the restless sea. The tide moves, the horizon waits, and the story, like the ocean, never truly ends.